Mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, bonjour. Nous sommes très heureux de vous retrouver.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. We're very glad to be with you for this third session of the European Summit on Islamic radicalization and the cyber threat. We met January 1st. We talked a lot about the political dimension of this threat, terrorist threat. And the second session was held in March. And now we're in June for the third and not the last, because there's going to be a fourth session. It's going to be in October, and in presence, hopefully, we'll try to gather all the speakers that we had from the very beginning of the creation of this European Summit, and participants, and also others, and in the perspective and the memory of the terrorist attack of September 11 and the geopolitical dimension of this terrorist threat, which is global, and we're not through with the analysis of all the parameters. I'm very glad that this third session to be around a topic that you all know, the fight against Islamism, a challenge for the safety and security of Europe. It's going to be the topic of the debate that will take place in a few minutes of the round table, emceed by Laurent with personalities, especially Theresa May, former Prime Minister of the UK, member of the European Parliament, of the British Parliament, and Manuel Valls, former French Prime Minister, who was with us from the very beginning of this summit. And together with him, we designed this summit, and he's supporting us in the design of this summit. And as we said previously, this should enable us to set the foundation of a wider dialogue, but also to bring forward concrete propositions to our various governments and to the European Union to inform, to better fight against terrorism and the Islamic radicalization. We are in 2021, maybe at a turning point of the started technically January 1st, 2000, but we see with the various elements that came one after the other, 20 years later, we can feel what others noticed about the 20th century, that the 21st century starts maybe in 2021, because that's the time when we come out from a crisis, if we are out of it, of this health crisis that stopped the world for over a year and who will extend for some months and maybe some years. We feel that there is a progress of a certain amount of other preoccupations which are global and very important, about the climate, the globalization of the Islamic masses, the asymmetrical war, which is a global war. It's a war without any location besides the cyberspace. And this is going to be a topic that we'll address in the second part of this webinar. I'll try to close the meeting, see how we can summarize what has been already said, done, and based on what's going to be said today, what will be the conclusions we will derive from our today's discussion. I would like, with much further ado, leave the floor to John Ryan, who's the manager of our new office in London. And I'm glad that ELNET is growing. We have offices in Israel, of course, in the United States, you know already. We are a European organization. We have an office in Paris. This is where from I'm talking to you with our team. A very important office in Berlin, led by Carsten Oven, an office in Brussels, for the contact with Mark Schlusser, and in Warsaw with Marta Obica, and recently the London office, which has just opened. And John Ryan, please introduce the first discussion of the day, the first roundtable of the day, and around Laurent Deville, Mrs. Theresa May, and Mr. Manuel Valls, both former prime ministers of their respective countries. John, you have the floor. And let me remind you, for those who wish, you can listen to the simultaneous translation of the discussion, either in French or in English. And if I'm not erring, in German also. There is a translation in German also. And thank the two partners of the third session, the Institut Montaigne, who was with us for the second session, and also thank the Hans Seidel Foundation, the German foundation, who joined us for this third session. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a good afternoon, a productive afternoon, which is a very interesting afternoon. And I'll leave the floor for the intro of the various roundtables. I'll be supported by all the members of our team, David Kalpa, who was important in the organization of this summit and the choice of the various speakers. John Ryan, you have the floor.
Minister, and Monsieur Manuel Valls, former French Prime Minister. Mrs. May served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 2016 and 2019, only the second woman ever to hold the office. Her premiership marked the culmination of some 21 years of continuous service on the front bench, including 6 years as Home Secretary. And during this time, she was responsible for the safety and security of the United Kingdom, including policing, national security, borders, and immigration. She continues to serve as the Member of Parliament for 4 years. Theresa May, a very warm welcome to you today. It's lovely. Manuel Valls was born in Barcelona, Spain, and is the first Prime Minister of the Fifth Republic to have acquired French nationality by naturalization. And he joined the government of Jean-Marc Ayrault in 2012 as Minister of the Interior and was appointed Prime Minister by François Hollande in 2014 until 2016. As such, it was he who declared the state of emergency after the terror attacks of November the 13th, 2015 in Paris. He's now a municipal councillor in Barcelona. Manuel Valls, a very warm welcome to you today. Now I give the floor to Mrs. Mandeville, senior reporter at Le Figaro. Mrs. Mandeville.
Okay, thank you. Is everyone hearing me well? Yes. Thank you, John Ryan, for your words of welcome and introduction for both prime ministers. Je vais parler en français pour ma propre introduction, puisque nous sommes tout de même.
I'll speak in French since we are, after all, in Paris. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to MC this session devoted to the fight and struggle against Islamism in Europe. I am absolutely honored to be able to moderate a discussion between the two personalities who are Theresa May, warm welcome to you, and Manuel Valls. Hello, Mr. Prime Minister. You both, as Joan Ryan, were prime ministers, and you were before that home ministers, and as such, you took part into the implementation of the fight and prevention of Islamic terrorism. And you're also faced with terrible terrorist attacks during your tenure as prime ministers, especially in 2015 for Manuel Valls, and for you, Theresa May, especially a year 2017, which was terrifying, horrendous. All this obviously led you to deliver answers that will discuss operations of monitoring, of prevention of terrorist attacks. Many were foiled, but also policies of prevention, more linked to what is happening upstream. But what we see today that you have left is that this string of terrorist attacks goes on. There was not a gradation in horror. All those terrorist attacks are absolutely horrendous for our society. But what happened in October 2020 with the beheading of a teacher in history who tried to talk about tolerance, freedom of speech, showing caricatures to his pupils, remains in our minds. And recently we had in Rambouillet a police officer, a lady police officer who was aggressed and killed at the entrance of a police station outside of Paris. We also had attacks against worshippers in the church south of France. We see how far this threat, this remains a great threat. Same thing for you, Mrs. May. There were also terrorist attacks that went on, and especially the one of Reading by a radicalized Islamist who attacked a wanderer. All those situations weighing on the mind, collective mind of our society, and who will go on weighing and designing the choices of our citizens and our leaders. My first question to Ms. May is why? Why is all this going on at such a pace? Why are we so hapless facing the Islamism?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. And it's very good to join you today, and particularly good to be joining Manuel Valls, who, as you said in your introduction, we were both interior ministers and worked together as interior ministers in our respective countries. You've asked a very wide-ranging question about why we see, I think you said, why do we seem to be so powerless in the face of Islam? I would say we're not powerless, but we haven't yet won the battle against radical Islamism. And is recognizing that this is a perversion of a great religion. This is a radical philosophy, And it is something that if we are truly going to be able to deal with it, we need to target the extremism, that radical philosophy, which is what leads to the terrorism. And I think very often in the past, it's taken a while, it's taken some time for people to recognize that it isn't just about what you might consider to be security measures, how many police officers we have, the funding for our intelligence agents, wider approach across society. If we're going truly to deal with this philosophy, with this extremism that leads people into the route of respect elsewhere. That's a bell for the House of Commons. But it took some time, I think, in the UK for people to recognise that this did have to be addressed in those terms as a philosophy of extremism, and we have to deal with the extremism. So we've taken steps to do that, but this does take a long time. And sadly, as we are doing our best to work through this and to draw people away from an extremist mentality, from an extremist route, we see that around us that there are yet more ways of the radicals, the Islamists, preaching this extremism, and the use of social media and the internet and social media platforms is a key issue here in our fight against extremism, against the extremism that leads to terrorism. This is something I know I've worked with, Manuel and I will have discussed this in the past. I worked with Emmanuel Macron on this issue, that we need to ensure that we are taking action to stop this vile philosophy of radical Islamism from being preached across the social media networks, as well as individually to people in our streets or in mosques. So I don't think we're powerless, but we haven't yet won the battle against this radical philosophy.
Thank you very much. Manuel Valls, êtes-vous d'accord avec Theresa May?
Manuel Valls, you agree on that issue about this point of the ideology, which was underestimated when we worked on Islamic terrorism, when we talked about surveillance, about the networks. But at the end of the day, this issue of ideology and this continuum, I mean, those who are targeting, as Theresa May said, some members of the population, Muslim population, or others, is this issue which is underrated and underestimated today in our countries? First of all, I'd like to commend Theresa May. I hope you hear me well. Commend her leadership and tell her how pleased and how interested I was to work with her when she was Home Minister or head of the British government. Together with her, and she was more experienced than I was, we noticed in 2012 with other Home Ministers of Europe about the kind of threat, new kind of threat we were facing, meaning young Brits or French or people living in our territories who went to Iraq and to Syria to fight in the ranks of what would become the Islamic State, ISIS, and fight against us. For years, we had to face a terrorism coming from the outside, and progressively, at the end of the 90s, beginning of the year 2000, in France and in the UK and in other countries, it's within our own societies that we discovered individuals, Brits or French, or living there for a long time, that decided suddenly to engage themselves against our values, our democracies, in the name of a ideology of a derailed Islam. I alluded to the fact in 2012 that we were facing an external enemy and an home enemy. I can add today that as Theresa May said, it's a struggle, a long haul struggle. It's security, it's legal, but to eradicate Islamism, to uproot political Islam on the European soil will need a lot of means. It's going to be long. We have to convince, and it's a struggle of idea. It's an ideological, philosophical war, a war of values that we have to undertake against this ideology, against those who are delivering that, essentially the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi, against the Al-Qaeda or Islamic State organizations and proxies in the Middle East or in Libya, but are being rebuilt on their own soil. And the targets are the Muslim communities in Europe. We have to lead this battle together with the Muslims around the world and in our countries in Europe, and know against whom we're fighting. Muslim brothers, those who are helping them through the TVs and others. I think about countries, but not to be at the helm enables me to name them, Turkey and Qatar. We have to convince that our values are universal values, and Islam has its own room in our space of Europe, and together we have to uproot the political Islam and Islamism, which has a totalitarian project in our societies, and especially for the Muslims. Thank you, Manuel Valls. Theresa May.
This sort of ecosystem in which Islamism and thrives. Some people in the United Kingdom, I remember I was there during the terrorist attack of 2017. There was the guy called Haras Rafiq, who is Foundation, a foundation that I know worked then when you were prime minister with the government in the preventive part of this fight against Islamism. And he was saying that, in fact, Netherlands, despite the fact that there was the recognition of the existence of Trojan horses inside British society, it was extremely difficult to fight the Muslim Brotherhood, that they were widely rooted in the United Kingdom with more than 25, I think, organizations, extremely active everywhere, active on campuses, in the heart of society. So what is the problem there? What is the obstacle for fighting this ideology, and to what extent is the fear of being accused of Islamophobia? Because these organizations, they work on this idea that you're not being tolerant, and our societies have put tolerance at the basis of society, and sometimes getting to accept the unacceptable in the name of tolerance. So how do you see this?
Well, I think one of the difficulties is about the language in which we refer to this issue. And Manuel and I have both talked about Islamism, radical Islamism. The danger is there are some people who worry that if they use that language, then they are being seen as attacking Islam itself, which of course is not the case. And it's drawing this distinction between Islam as a great religion and the Islamists who have perverted that religion. Partly it's to do with civil war within the religion itself, partly it's to do with a political philosophy, the desire to establish a caliphate, but they have perverted the religion of Islam. And it's ensuring that we can draw that distinction, which I think is so important. And it's some people do have a worry about how to draw that distinction, and that they will be seen to be, in some sense, attacking Islam or attacking Muslim communities, when in fact what is being done is attacking the extremists, attacking those who would encourage others to abandon our values. Manuel was absolutely right to talk about the universal values that we hold. And these people, these extremists, are attacking those values. They are attempting to divide our society. So I think getting that language right, getting that understanding of what it is that is this extremist message that drives the route down to terrorism, I think is particularly important. And it is a difficulty in the many communities that we have here in the UK. For example, I imagine the same will be true in France. Actually getting the message to the people who need to hear it can be quite difficult. Many of these communities, there will be often a very hierarchical structure in terms of the elders, who are the ones who expect the government to communicate with them. Whereas in fact, what we need to be doing is getting the message and working with people at the grassroots, particularly young people who may be susceptible for a variety of reasons to listening to this extremist message and taking that message on board. There's one other element I'd like to inject into this, which is the importance of identity. I think one of the great challenges is that in trying to divide our society, what the extremists do is preach a message that you can't be both Muslim and British. I'm sure they preach in France that you can't be both Muslim and French, that you have to choose one of these identities. Whereas we know that you can be both. Just as here in the UK, you can be from any one of the 4 nations of the UK and a Hindu or a Roman Catholic or not have any religion whatsoever. We are all a mixture of these identities, but the extremists try to focus people and say you can only have one identity and you have to choose between that. And that we have to deal with that and to show, and it's why being able to show role models, so people who are perhaps good, politicians or sports people or people in the arts who are from a Muslim background who consider themselves to be British, can show how actually this attempt to divide the identities is so false and is a message from the extremists. So there is, as Manuel said, it is a long-term battle and a long-term fight because there's an awful lot of work to do. But trying to get to the grassroots, talk to young people and ensure them of their, that ability to be Muslim and British, to contribute to our society and be faithful to their religion is, I think, a key part of this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Did you, if I may ask you, did you have the feeling that actually you were not helped in establishing these links and defending this distinction that you just made between radical Islam and Islam, and by the left? Because frankly, at the moment when you were Prime Minister, you had at the top of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who actually stated that the question had nothing to do with the ideology of Islamism and everything to do with lack of police and with the foreign policy of Great Britain, which was responsible for this radicalization, and in fact, saying that was in fact behind these attacks on Islamism.
I think one of the problems that we've faced is that actually the extremes on both sides of the political argument, on both the right and the left, have taken positions which have not been helpful in addressing this key issue. Jeremy Corbyn, I think during his time as the Labour leader, one of the key issues was the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, about which much has been said. That attitude of anti-Semitism, also that attitude that said that this was not about Islamism, but it was about other issues, certainly did not help in the overall debate in being able to address this issue. I think it's also true to say that, as I was saying earlier, it's not everybody has completely recognised the importance of dealing with the extremist message. Not everybody who one might describe as an extremist will become a terrorist. However, actually somebody who becomes a terrorist will have been radicalized by that extremist message. And so dealing with that radicalization and that extremism is extremely, extremely important.
Thank you very much. Manuel Valls, je ne sais pas si vous voulez
Emmanuel Valls, would you like to discuss the distinction between Islam and Islamism? Back in your days as a prime minister, President Obama in the US did not want to use the term of radical Islamism. He was afraid to use that term, and he was afraid to offend the Muslim world. And he preferred to simply talk of extremism, which is a misleading term. So it's an important distinction as established by Theresa May. Let's try to move forward with our discussion. What about models? For a long time, models were pitted against each other. So the British model was multicultural, is multicultural, and the UK believed it is a superior model because it allows for more freedoms and enables the different communities to feel at home in the UK. But the French retorted, no, that is not true, because you have allowed your society to become a home for separate groups, separate communities, separate societies. Remember the whole idea of Londonistan. The French society disapproved of it. And so the French model believes itself to be a superior. It is a Republican model that puts aside religion and does not allow religion to inflame politics. So to some extent, secular government has become a fig leaf and is having a hard time managing the issue of Islamism. So there are two different models, but are we not coming to the same conclusion? And are we not faced with the same challenge, that is separatism? And that is a term used by the French president. I was a forerunner, and I'm saying this with zero modesty, and I apologize for it. I was one of the first to call a cat or a spade a spade. I talked of Islamism, I talked of radical extremism at the French National Assembly. I use these terms in reference to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi ideology. Now, the vast majority of Muslims are moderate Muslims, and they are the prime victims of radical Islamism. So we needed to establish the difference between Islam and Islamism. So obviously, there are lots of people who know more about this than I do, but this is a religious and cultural battle taking place within the world of Islam. It is a global battle. So words are important, as Theresa May rightly said, and we need to be careful in terms of the words we use. So Islamophobia is a word that has been coined, particularly in relation to Salman Rushdie. Now, in terms of the model, that is a key issue. And I do believe that both models, that are representatives from other countries here, but let's more specifically discuss the French and the UK model. They both have pros and cons, failures and successes, but let's recognize that we are faced with similar challenges. Now, the main issue, as far as I'm concerned, is that, let's be frank, many of French Muslims, maybe 25%, maybe 33%, believe or report to believe in this terrorist ideology. They profess to believe in fundamental Islam. And so there's a lot of, much of the younger generation report to believe and understand those motives. And this means we need to wage this battle in every way, at every level, in the legal arena, in the judicial field, out in the disenfranchised suburbs, in the prison system, where a lot of people become radicalized. And we have an expert in this field who we will hear very soon. Samuel Paty, the teacher, was decapitated because in his classroom he took a stance for democracy for secular government, for journalism, for Charlie Hebdo reporters. And so secular government, at the end of the day, you can call it whatever you want, but it boils down to our European model. And obviously there are caveats and differences, which I am respectful of between the different EU countries. So the values that between church and state, irrespective of what church we're talking about. And also we stand for equality between men and women. Look at that young woman, that teenager called Mila, who received death threats for speaking against Islam online. We fight anti-Semitism. We fight hatred against Israel, for anti-Zionism, which is just a fig leaf for anti-Semitism, which has caused so much damage within the UK Labour Party. And part of the political left, whether in the UK or in France, for reasons that are too long to explain, but basically vote catching, have succumbed to anti-Semitism. They have, at the very least, tolerated anti-Semitism, and that is true of Jeremy Corbyn. And they have agreed to alliances with the new proletariat. So an amorphous mass of Muslims. So we have to wage this battle on the basis of words, but also on the basis of this model, this European model that we stand for, which is based on tolerance. And we're also fighting on the ground against the Muslim Brotherhood, against the Salafi ideology, political. This is where they want to take us. And it is why we need to separate between Islam and political Islamism. And we need to protect our Muslim citizens who are, as I said before, targets for political Islamism. But this is a civilizational model, a European civilizational, organizational, democratic model, which is based on gender parity, equality between men and women. So irrespective of the model, at the end of the day, we're dealing with the same challenges. Needless to say, we in France believe that religious signs or symbols should not be worn within the school system. So the models may be different, but we are faced with similar challenges. And just as Theresa May rightly stated, in recent years, our various countries, not just France or the UK, but the other countries, whether or not they're part of the EU, working together with Israel, working together with the parties that signed the Abraham Accords, together with our friends from the United Arab Emirates, we believe in this civilizational model. This is an all-out war against political Islamism. Thank you very much. A quick word. You have 5 minutes for one last question.
You may want to say add something or react on what Manuel Valls has just said, but I wanted to approach this question. I mean, sort of continue what he's saying by asking you to what extent actually the European legal system has enabled these Islamists to use our rights and our courts and our system of liberties to promote their ideology and actually to push their action in our societies. I think that it was you who actually complained at some point when you were prime minister about the way that the European, the Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights had actually gone too far in the way they are defending certain causes and sort of depriving nation states of the capacity to defend actually these same the democracy and I'm wondering how if there is a sort of Gulliver syndrome in our nation states because of this situation we are in, and would you say that this question of Islamist terrorism was one of the major reasons for Brexit and for the British to sort of free themselves of certain chains of that they would have in Europe in these matters?
If I may answer your very last question first. No, I don't think it was that led to Brexit. There were two key issues in relation to Brexit. One was immigration rules. There were a lot of people in the UK for whom the freedom of movement for Europeans was difficult to accept when there were other countries, particularly when there were other countries in the Commonwealth who we'd had longer historic links with, who didn't have that freedom. And there was also an issue of the numbers of people migrating to the UK. And then, of course, there was just a natural British instinct not to want to be following the rules that were set in Brussels. But underpinning the Brexit vote was something much more general, which was a sense that people wanted change, that they felt their politicians weren't listening and responding to their concerns. It's part of that wider issue we see in politics across the world today, which has touched countries like France and others in Europe too. This sense that globalization has been good for some people but not for others, and that we need to have that sense of ensuring that all our citizens are able to benefit. So I described it as a country that works for everyone. Boris Johnson talks about levelling up. It's the same concept, that we want to ensure that every part of our country is benefiting from our economic development with good jobs, housing, and improving their lives. So that lay absolutely fundamentally behind the Brexit vote. But if I may go back to the other question you were raising, the point I made about the European Court of Human Rights was made partly because of the difficulties we had had in some cases. So when I was Home Secretary, we had an individual called Abu Qatada that we wanted to be stopped from doing this by the European Court of Human Rights. We did it in the end. We managed to find a legal way of doing it through an agreement with Jordan, which satisfied the European Court. But there was that sense here in the UK that the UK government wanted to deport somebody that they felt was a potential threat to people in the UK and the safety of people in the UK, but it was that European Court of Human Rights that was stopping us from doing this. But this is at the very heart of the issues that we all face when we're in government, which is that balance between taking the actions to provide the safety and security for our citizens, while at the same time respecting their human rights and upholding the values that are at the very core of our societies and our democracies. We are constantly in government walking that tightrope, if you like, between those two and balancing those two. And those are the issues. We have different legal systems in the UK and France. In France, you have some slightly greater powers in terms of detention of people before you're able to charge them than we have here in the UK. But that fundamental issue of finding a way to ensure you have the tools and powers to keep people safe, while at the same time ensuring that you are maintaining their human rights and not usurping the values that we hold dear, is what lies at the heart of this. And of course, those who are extremists, those who are terrorists, will push against that boundary. But as I'm sure Manuel would say, if you react too much in terms of the imposition on people and removal of their rights, then the terrorists have won, because then their argument has won, and we must not go down that road. So yes, it's a difficult balance to find, but I think we constantly do manage to find it and operate in a way that enables us to do what we want to do, which is to keep our people safe. Sometimes, unfortunately, the terrorists do get through, and the terrorists are able, as we know, to commit horrific attacks, as they have done in both our countries and elsewhere in Europe. So the fight continues, but we must never forget what are the values that underpin our democracy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give, if I have time, 1 minute to Manuel Valls, or is it not possible? Yes, on this very point of how do we preserve democracy while fighting those who want to destroy democracy?
Democracy and the rule of law are fundamental, and it's important to protect it against those who wish it harm. whether or not they come from the right or the left end of the political spectrum, we should never give up on justice, democracy, and the rule of law. But what we want from citizens is cooperation, and also cooperation between governments, between intelligence services, between the different authorities. And we have worked really well with Theresa May back in the day. We need to follow the money. We need to bring down these fundamentalist mosques. We needed to revoke the French citizenship of those who mean us harm. We need to deport those foreign nationals that do not respect our rules and our values. We need to work more effectively and more efficiently while using the weapons of the rule of law. And obviously these change every time legislation changes, but obviously the core value of our struggle is democracy, and this is how we win. What the fundamentalist and Islamist extremist want is the civilizational clash. They want a civil war, so we fight civil war with tolerance and other such values in our respective countries. And obviously we are faced with other challenges, but other challenges such as immigration, and that's a different story. But once again, it is the name of our civilization, of our shared values, of democracy and of freedom that we will prevail. It's going to take a while, but we will eventually prevail. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Valls, thank you very much, Theresa May, for this conversation. An all too short and fascinating conversation, of course. We have not exhausted this subject, so handing over now for the next panel. Thank you very much, Laure. That was fascinating. What a beautiful introduction to our seminar. Now, discussing the fight against anti-Semitism. Interesting Freudian slip. I meant the fight against Islamist extremism. Let me say a few words on the battle of words. Words are ideas, ideas of values. And many thanks to Manuel Valls for reminding us of Mila, that young woman who's taken a stance. This is a young lady, a young girl who is extremely brave, and her name is Mila. And Mila happens to be a famous Hebrew name, even though she's not Jewish at all. And Mila means words, it means discourse. And it is our words and our discourse that Islamists seek to extinguish. And we need to make more room for those words, for this discourse. So without further ado, let's get this first roundtable started. My friend and colleague will be moderating it. He is the director of this European program, David Kalfa. David is going to introduce the roundtable on how to fight cyber jihadism. I'm looking forward to hearing what our experts have to say on the topic.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Je voudrais d'abord remercier
Good afternoon, one and all. Many thanks to Lord Montville for moderating this fascinating conversation between former Prime Ministers Manuel Valls and Theresa May. Without further ado, let's introduce the first panel, the first roundtable of today. I'd like to start by saying that jihadism is a challenge. It's a societal, an intellectual, and a security challenge. As we have already seen, there's a red line we need to walk in order to address the issue without falling into the two traps of all-out extremism and denial. So we have identified two key themes for this third edition of the ELNET Summit. First of all, evaluation of European public policy for de-radicalization, and secondly, jihadism 2.0 and online radicalization. Now, getting back to the first panel, which I have the honor of introducing, I am bringing in experts from different European countries, including France and Belgium, and they will try and help us understand the mechanisms behind radicalization so we can better understand efficacy, efficiency, or effectiveness of European public policy. So the lines are blurred from a conceptual point of view, and it's not just semantics. We're talking less and less of de-radicalization and more of disengagement. Now, disengagement means renouncing violence. That's the objective we're trying to achieve. But de-radicalization would mean changing a person's beliefs and their mindset. So radicalization can be defined as follows. The experts will get back to this particular mechanism, but it's a process that leads an individual to break away from the society where they live in order to embrace a violent ideology. So de-radicalization means undoing this process and encouraging these individuals' reintegration into society. So against this backdrop, we use the term rehabilitation. So these are all of the prevention and de-radicalization measures that come under the term counter-radicalization. So it's an important conceptual aspect, and Mark discusses it in his latest book, and there's no scientific consensus regarding the causes and the terms and conditions of this phenomenon. So is there or is there not a specific approach in Belgium, in France, in Germany, in the United Emirates in terms of de-radicalization or disengagement? And is there a difference between jihadism as it exists in reality and also perception of it by public authorities? And also, what can we learn on a provisional level from such disengagement efforts? Now, I'm not saying this is a twofold reconfiguration, but jihadism is shifting from in real life to online, and they're investing in encrypted networks and online platforms. We will also review measures to regulate this investment by jihadis of the online space, and how do we fight jihadi propaganda. So this is a brief introduction. Many thanks to our partners, the Montaigne Institute on the one hand, but also the Hans Seidel Foundation. Many thanks also to Mark, who received the Geopolitical Prize for his book on a 20-year war in the 20th century. And without further ado, I will hand over to Gauthier, a chronicler for international policy at France 24. Gauthier, you have the floor. We cannot hear Gauthier. The microphone is off. Yes, we can hear you now, kind sir. Thank you. Perfect. From the top, please. Now, let's make the most efficient use of our time. I wanted to add a few words regarding an issue that ties in with what David just referred to. By way of introduction, we are seeing a shift from de-radicalization on the one hand and disengagement on the other. Now, this is a question we can put to the different speakers regarding the respective countries, but at the end of the day, does this not mean delegation? Because we feel bad, because the people in power, our governments, feel bad, do we not outsource this issue of disengagement to Muslim authorities? Have we not renounced that? The effort to de-radicalize, are we not settling for disengagement, using political channels, political resources? Are we not delegating the job to Muslim authorities within our respective countries? Are we not turning to Muslim authorities in our respective countries, whatever the names are? So this is my caveat, this is my question, and then we will address the issues broached by David Khalfa and how we can discuss those issues based on that particular aspect that I just discussed. Now, David just referred to David Becker's book on the 20-year war on jihadism in the 20th century. And together, we also have a colleague from Germany, and he is in charge of EGAP, the German Council for Foreign Policy, and she is a researcher on Islamism. So she does research on Islamism, security. So she's also in charge of the security program within that organization. We have the executive director from Hidayah, president of the Foreign Affairs Committee for Defense and Home Affairs at the United Arab Emirates. Welcome, kind sir. Now we have with us Thomas Renard, who works at the Egmont Institute. He specializes in counterterrorism and radicalization. And lastly, Hugo Micheron from France. He's a postdoc researcher at the Transregional Institute at Princeton University, and he authored a book on French jihadism. So if that's all right with you, let's start with Martin. The questions that have been raised by David Khalfa. Can we try and see whether my assumption can be verified? Mark, you got the floor.
I'll start right away about your assumption. I think it is not verified, in my opinion. The disengagement, the difference between disengagement and de-radicalization is that disengagement can be more easily controlled than de-radicalization. The radicalization is in the minds. Check if someone changes vision of the world is very difficult to monitor. It leaves the room to what we call the taqiyya, the dissimulation of what we really think. Disengagement is something more objective. It's check if someone is in link or not in connection with a radicalized group and goes towards the respect and abiding by of the law and by abandoning the recourse to violence. In fact, the people on the institutions who make this control are not religious institutions. It's the state. It's the Ministry of Justice when people are under legal control, or Home Ministry when you're on the rationale of control by the intelligence services or of administrative surveillance. It can also be a support by programs, private programs under contract with the government. And then it's going to be social workers, psychologists, even specialists of the religious arena, Islamologists or members of the Muslim clergy. We're not on religious actors, but government actors. I'd like to remind quickly 3 points because we don't have a lot of time. First one is that there's no European policy in terms of de-radicalization. What exists are various experiences according to the various European states. Now, what does exist is a network financed by European Union, regrouping some operators and searchers, enabling to share good practice among states, but then states are free to implement them or not. And it's private players who are under control and under contract with the states who adopt these methods of disengagement. Second, our country, France, went late into the prevention of radicalization. The first measures in this direction came in 2013, 2015 with first experience, which are not positive. There were major failures. Sometimes we even had to go to court for finding serious partners. I come to my last point. The practices in terms of disengagement were stabilized in France, and I'm talking about the disengagement in open ground for people leaving jail with two programs, one called RIVE, R-I-V-E, and the other is called PAIRS, P-A-I-R-S programs, dedicated to jihadists after jail, with three parts: a social part, a psychological part, and an ideological one. It gives encouraging outputs, but it's very fragile. It's not the top of the spectrum individuals which are oriented towards this program. Those are still in jail, but they will be released soon. Very concretely, out of the 10 individuals who follow those programs since 2016, no one perpetrated a new terrorist attack ever since. There was one in this program who went back to jail, but it was for drug trafficking. Those results are encouraging, but as I said, they remain fragile, and we should examine in the future the outcome in the years to come to see if those encouraging signs are consolidated. Thank you, Mr. Hecker. So, Sophia Koller, you have the floor.
Bonjour à tous and good afternoon from Berlin. As a good pupil from Germany, of course, I have prepared a little presentation to support my presentation today, but I'm not sure if this will work. So we'll just start and then we will see if the slides appear or not, but bear with me if it's without the slides. So I'm very happy that we have already talked about this very important difference between de-radicalization and disengagement, because this would have been the first point to make, a very important distinction, and also to respond to the question of, if we're leaving out the de-radicalization effort. I think it's really important to remember that we cannot control the minds of our citizens, and it is not the responsibility of our state in a democratic setting to actually say what other people have to think, that we cannot look into this inside their heads, but rather focus that they are not violent and acting upon those ideas. So I think that's maybe my first contribution to that aspect. And then more specifically, I'm leading a project at the DJP, not leading DJP itself. And it would be not making justice to the very diverse landscape of Germany to present just one project, but rather I will try to have a broad overlook of what Germany is doing in terms of de-radicalization disengagement work. What helps, in my opinion, is to remember two aspects. One aspect is that Germany is a federal state, which means that the topics that we are talking about today, national security, education, but also integration, for example, and of course prevention work more general, is the responsibility of the state, so the Bundesländer, and not the federal, the whole of Germany. And I think this is why we have to remember that each of these states have developed their own approaches depending on their challenges and their experiences on the ground. The second aspect is that we have heard from Mark that unlike other countries like France, we have been unfortunately experiencing other forms of extremism for decades. So that means that we have quite a strong, especially civil society, that has been grappling with both left-wing extremism, but also right-wing extremism. And now the challenge of Islamist extremism is, of course, profiting from these decades of experience, both from a state, but especially from a civil society perspective. And this is why it's really important to keep in mind that overall in Germany, there are so many projects locally that deal with exit work, that deal with disengagement, mostly from a civil society perspective, but also from the state sector, that this can be one of the advantages that depending on what is seen on the ground, what are the local dynamics, these projects can, built on their experience on the ground and of their knowledge of local actors and the local community, to help those clients of them to reintegrate into society. The other aspect is that the strong role of civil society, of course, comes with support of the state. But still, this independence from the state and from state policies is, I think, another advantage and disadvantage at the same time, because, of course, there's lack of a overall coordination, maybe in terms of what disengagement and de-radicalization work is in Germany. And to come quickly to the question of evaluation, this is something that in Germany has been really focusing on in the past years, to make more and more efforts to monitor and also evaluate what are we doing? Does it work what we are doing? And very tentatively, I think that the first results that we have from these reports and studies and insights into the projects and programs is that yes, there is tentatively a positive result, meaning that we had no bigger attacks, and that what practitioners report from the ground is that they are quite successful in helping people exit extremist structures and extremist ideologies. But then again, the question is, what is success? What do we talk about? Only because a person does not attack now, they might be re-engaged in 10 years. So this is why I think it's important to keep in mind that evaluating the effectiveness and the impact of disengagement work is extremely difficult, and we're just starting our journey in this regard. And then I'm seeing that my slides are on, so maybe to the next slide with the case management. I cannot see the slides, but I trust that you will see something on your screens. So excuse if they're not matching my words. So I wanted to talk very quickly about the challenges, or what I would recommend, also in a European perspective. So the case management and disengagement work has so many actors that have to cooperate together. So it's not only about the justice sector, it's about security services, but also psychosocial support. It's about education, providing access to housing. And these actors are not necessarily having very much experience in working with potential extremists or people coming right from prison or returning from Syria. So this is why we really have to focus on strengthening this kind of multi-agency cooperation, for example, better organized knowledge exchange and also ensure data protection. It's important to build more capacity, both those actors that are actually working in exit work the whole day, but also those that are normally working with the more general public, such as youth welfare. And then it's really interesting because both Theresa May and Manuel Valls mentioned this in their insights, is that it takes a long time, right? So it's a long-term effort that we're talking about. So I'm asking the question, if we agree even at the highest level that this is a long-term effort, and I agree because disengagement processes can take a long time, then why are we not funding our civil society structures, at least in Germany, but also other countries, to actually achieve this long-term effort? Not financing them 1 year or 2 years, but really making sure that trustful relationships that are so important to help people disengage and also de-radicalize at some point can be achieved. And this is maybe what I would contribute as an opening statement, and I'm happy to discuss further. Thank you.
Merci, Sophia Kola. Passons la parole maintenant au docteur.
Thank you, Dr. Ali Al-Noaimi from the United Arab Emirates. You have the floor.
Well, good day to everyone. Well, I use a different approach. First of all, we have to differentiate between Islam as a religion and Islam as an ideology that's used by these terrorist and extremist organizations. And it's a global threat. It's not in Europe only. And this is why we need a global approach and global effort to counter that. Believe me, if we couldn't counter extremist and terrorism organization in our region, you won't be able to do that in Europe. Globalism is everywhere, and these organizations, they don't believe in boundaries. They don't respect any laws or sovereignty of any nation. So what you are suffering now in Europe, it's because we are suffering also in our region. So we need a collective effort. This is one. Two, we have to understand the mindset of these extremists, especially when these, when they're taught, their mindset is based on an ideology, the root is in religion. They don't respect law. They don't see whatever you will add to them, or the social services and the lifestyle that you will offer them. They see you as an enemy, because in their ideology, you are an enemy. And I believe that Europe failed actually to counter extremism, because each country, they don't have a national plan to do so, because they don't have the political will, I believe, to do so. I've been working with many European friends since 2012. What I saw from them, they can't differentiate between the freedom of speech and the freedom of hate and promoting extremism, which is at the end a freedom to kill. Many of our European friends, they don't want to admit now that in many cities, in some parts of the cities in Europe, the second language is the local language. The second language is some French cities is the French language. And in some towns in Germany, the second language is the German. The same thing in the UK. And this is because they don't have a national plan for the integration of Muslim within the large community. A plan that should have a narrative that will gain the heart and the mind of the Muslim. Muslim in Europe, they have an issue of identity. They don't feel that they are European. Sometimes some of them, they see that they are neglected. So what I think we don't need from a politician to come and speak up with a language to counter extremism, to gain some election, or to gain the heart and the mind of the far right. No, we need them to speak up, to come forward, and to gain the heart and the mind, especially of the youth and the women within their Muslim citizens. So what I think is this. I think it's a priority first to see this as a threat to all of us. I'll give you an example. Many European countries, they see the threat coming to them from these terrorist and extremist organizations, but they don't see the same threat when they target us. When we started the Abraham Accord, unfortunately, in Europe, especially in the UK, those Muslim Brotherhood, they form a new organization against the normalization with Israel, against the Abraham Accord. I believe this is a freedom of expression. They have the right to do so. But when it comes to promoting hate, no. Before 2 weeks, we had in Dubai a Holocaust exhibition. From the UK, they start attacking us. And the narrative that they use, actually, it was promoting hate, encouraging, saying that we are no longer Muslim because we are, having this Holocaust exhibition in the UAE. So I think in Europe, what you need a political will to have a plan based on prevention. If you think about the radicalization, what about what's happening in the mosques and Islamic centers and the Islamic schools every day in Europe? You don't control that narrative. I understand you will say this is a freedom of speech, we can do it. Believe me, it will be too late when you find out what will happen later on. Because if you think it's a priority for your national security to what's happening in your schools, in the Islamic schools, in the mosques, in the Islamic centers every day, they are preaching hate and extremism. You have to have a plan to counter that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thomas Renard, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Thanks all of the organizers for this invitation. And I would like to commend Mark Hecker for this prize awarded to him, which is really deserved for his book. I'd like to present the Belgian approach through 3 points. First, I'll echo to what has been said. We're not talking anymore in Belgium about de-radicalization, but of prevention or struggle against radicalization, against extremism, or taking into account radicalism, disengagement, rehabilitation, a whole array of words, except de-radicalization. And those semantic elements in this new language is not just like that. It's an evolution of the practice in this way of doing. It's not harmless. The Ministry of Justice produced its plan against radicalization. This plan talks about de-radicalization, but very quickly, during the implementation, the word de-radicalization was abandoned on the base of experience, on the base of disengagement, in favor of disengagement. Second, the specific field of prevention is very recent in Belgium, in France too, as Mark said, like in most of European countries, except in the UK and Denmark and Netherlands. Even if in Belgium, we built this on the base of practices in Belgium in terms of prevention, in terms of drug use, through a proximity police, neighborhood police. We started that with the years 90 and 2000. And being inspired by what's doing elsewhere in Europe, in the UK and in Denmark and in the Netherlands. The first elements of those programs of disengagement appear as from 2013 at the local scale, something which is anchored very locally with a local police and feel the need to implement a certain amount of tool, new, due to the lack of the support of federal state. Even if this has been developed structurally as of 2014, 2015, following the terrorist attack of Namr Demush against the Jewish Museum in May 2014, and the dismantling of a terrorist cell in Vervilliers in 2015, planning a terrorist attack. What happens in Belgium, very obviously, we widened the classical scope, the traditional scope of anti-terrorism. We work much more upstream with prevention work, essentially locally. And we're also working downstream, far from the anti-terrorism approach, with the program of disengagement in the jails, in prison, on a voluntary base. Compulsory program during the probation period of the people released from jail, from prison, and other programs which are offered, available after the probation period. We implemented a more holistic approach, multi-institutional, taking into account of the people impacted by radicalization with interesting practices, namely the multi-institutional local roundtables, discussion, debates for prevention matters or for security matters with various types of players or actors, intelligence, courts, intelligence, prevention, police, the associative network with bridges among those various platforms. And we also implemented, I'm not going to quote all the tools, a shared database managed by us, a Center of Prevention of Terrorism, enabling for the relevant information to be circulated, to be shared among the various services. We developed a enabling us to work upstream and downstream, and enabling various actors to share information and develop the best possible approach in terms of prevention and or support and disengagement. And third point I wish to raise, echoing to what Zofia Kohler said, is that in spite of the federal Belgian structure that might be very complex sometimes and criticized, it's the sharing of competences in Belgium is crystal clear in anti-terrorism and fight against radicalization. Federal states is in charge of legal and security, with very few services, easing the cooperation and the sharing. That's good in a small country. And the federated services and the local entities, municipalities, in charge of prevention and supervision of the skills, competences, which is clear in Belgium. Even if it's true, there are some areas of tension between some players, some approaches, some visions. We can also criticize the implementation, the late implementation of things like disengagement programs in jail that were announced in 2015, start in 2016, and really get full speed in 2017, when a certain amount of individuals coming back from Syria start to getting out from prison, and a certain amount of criticism can be leveled at this implementation of our efforts. And the assessments of Mark and Zofia, I concur. In spite of the criticism against Belgium, my assessment is that about the programs of disengagement and of development of the policy of struggle against radicalization in Belgium is rather positive as a whole, even if I concur what has been said previously, even if again we will have to go on with this long-term effort, and we need really to step back a little bit to have a full evaluation, because it's a moving topic and it's a continuous effort. I'll stop there. Thank you, Thomas Renard. Hugo Micheron, you have the floor. Hello, thank you, organizers, for having set up this very important conference on this really very interesting topic. First, the experimental nature of the works underway in terms of disengagement. I wish to highlight the importance in understanding the nature of the matter we're discussing. Jihadism is not a matter like any other. It's a matter that is not very easy, very flexible. We are dealing with an explosive matter. If it's wrongly dealt with and individuals are in recidive, the consequences can be disastrous. Much more important if it's just a general gangster. Terrorism has a high impact on lives, but it has also a very important political impact when we see that the polarization in Europe around the jihadi items is very important. That was important to remind as an introduction. We're not talking in terms of jihadism, of accumulation of individual cases. That's what we call about disengagement. We talk about individual disengagement. Someone would agree to stop using violence as a method. And it would mean that someone would be disengaged from violence. For me, jihadism is already the earmark of an individual who is within a group on a rationale which is much wider than just the accumulation of individual cases targeted by the disengagement wording. Well, philosophically, the issue is that this ignores what Dr. Ali Al-Noaimi said, the dynamic of jihad groups who are following various cycles. And we have to remind that jihadism in 2015, at the time of ISIS, was at its height. From an organizational point of view, it's not the same, and not can think of itself in the same way as jihadism in 2021, when ISIS has been destroyed in the Middle East. And the networks, the operational and logistic networks, were broken up, and they are in prison or killed. There is a difference of timing, which is being explained by the rationale of jihadism. And this is what we cannot understand. The activists of the jihad I met in the French jails, 80 of them, not talking about their external relays, all mentioned the importance to understand the difference between an active phase and a dormant phase, a phase of strength and a phase of weakness. This was built on the phase, the Muslim Brotherhoods radicalized of the 50s, explaining clearly that when they are in a strong phase, they're able to move into action. They have to multiply the terrorist attacks, be extremely visible, to successfully destroy what they regard as being the enemy system. And in Europe, the European democracy. But when they are in the weakness phase, conversely, they would do what some people talk the disengagement. They say, you shouldn't take arms. You should really be below the radar, multiply the ideological fight, rebuild the strength in order to gather more people, to recruit more people, to prepare the next strong phase. And if you look at this from a European jihadi point of view, since the 90s, there were 3 cycles between strengths and weakness. And each and every time, collectively, we understood it was going during the strong phase, a kind of fever, jihadi fever, but we did not understand what is happening during the weakness phase. And this is the mistake we are doing again for the future of Europe. If you look what happened in the 90s, there was the first series of terrorist attacks with the groups that call themselves in Europe. They started to be active in the end of the 90s. It made a certain amount of terrorist attacks, 9/11, which was made from Europe. And then there was the destruction of the networks in Europe and the organization of a terrorist attacks with Europeans in Iraq. And then it was ended. ISIS in Iraq was destroyed in the years 2000, and people were put in jail. And then you have the eruption of ISIS back again with a lot of Europeans and preparing what's going to be next.
Puisque le désengagement, évidemment, est volontaire à partir du point.
By definition, disengagement is voluntary, and they agree to disengage because they enter the quiet phase and they prepare for what comes next. They prepare for the next phase of strength. So what do we miss? We miss what's happening at the level of hundreds of thousands of individuals. They're simply changing the way that they're fighting. So we need to learn from this, and we need to really take an interest in what activists say and think, because they put it online. They make no secret about it. And so Dr. Ali Emouanilimi did mention the need to reflect on those issues, both at a global level and at a local level. So we need to look at what's happening upstream. We need to look at the root causes of why jihadism is growing in Europe. We discuss social and economic threats. Political issues are important as well. And I think we need to look at religious issues. And over the past 20 years, Salafi ideology has grown in Europe. And there's a hybrid version of Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is enabling jihadism to expand in Europe. Thank you, Hugo Micheron. Let's get the next sequence started. The next segment is going to last about 10 minutes. There's 5 of them, 5 of you, or rather, so you each have 2.5 minutes to answer. As I listen to you, I find similarities between your contributions. Remembering what Ms. Kohler said, I noticed that in terms of the rule of law, a government forbids itself from intruding into the thoughts and opinions of citizens. Also, I remember what Dr. Ali Al-Nouami said about some European societies' inability to conquer the hearts and minds. And also, Hugo Micheron talked about the need to analyze the targets of terrorism. These targets are sometimes difficult to identify and address. So the question I'm going to put to you is provocative by design. Public authorities, now, whether at the European level or elsewhere, have public authorities, or are they using the term of disengagement because they are renouncing, because they're giving up on the idea of conquering the hearts and minds of people? Let's start with Mark. Thank you. If that's okay with you, I'd like to respond to what Hugo said. It's very interesting. Obviously, this merits a longer conversation, but I only have 2.5 minutes. Now, in terms of what Sophia, Thomas, and Hugo said, there's no contradiction there. At the end of the day, it's all about proportions, isn't it? Now, you have a flock of radicalized individuals in European countries. In France, we're talking a lot of people. Now, 23,000 individuals have been flagged. There are about 8,000 of them that are considered as active threats. So the question is, how many of them are ideologists capable of building a theory whereby there are different phases, weakness followed by strength, and the need and the ability to mask your true intent. So how do you tell the difference between the ideologists and the ranks, the rank and file, the soldiers, the foot soldiers? So out of those 80 people, there were maybe 70 ideologists and 10 ranks, 10 infantry, 10 foot soldiers. And so if you look at those 70 ideologists, which is important already because you need to address the ideology, right? And then you can focus on security. And maybe also as part of a disengagement rationale, then you focus on the other 10. But to me, there's really no contradiction. You need to look at things at the different levels. So strategy, theory, weakness, followed by strength, followed by weakness, etc. And then you need to work at a different level. What's happening at the level of a particular neighborhood, a particular district? That's a space that has been clearly identified. And then what happens at the individual level, at the personal level? And programs as designed today are focusing on individual cases. The way they've been designed at the level of European countries, much more so than at a global or general level. In the PAIR program, I stands for individual. So to me, there's no contradiction. The two go hand in hand, and the different players may be involved depending on the level at which you're working. I'm going to stop here, leave some room for other people to answer. Sophia Kohler, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I will return to English because it's easier for me. If not, I'm tempted to join the French debate, maybe another time. Said that it's not really contradicting between our understandings, and maybe three aspects about this. So I think that yes, it's true that there might be people that just pretend to be disengaged or even de-radicalized and then laying low, waiting for their time to engage again. So this is nothing that is unknown, and there have been examples where this kind of dissimulation has been taking place. I would just argue that since the German approach and all the other approaches are based on the voluntariness of people engaging with these kind of programs, the people that you are talking about, I don't think that they would join disengagement programs, right? Like, I don't think that they would, come and really spend a lot of time with these counselors. I think they, you know, they would maybe have one talk and say, well, no, I'm already disengaged. I don't need you. I don't need you to build a new life with me. Maybe there are exceptions, but I don't think that they would, you know, take part in that kind of project, or at least not normally. But rather, yes, there are also, you know, nothing that I don't contradict. There is also security services, right? Like there is intelligence that they would say, okay, this guy, you know, has been active. Why is he not active anymore? So it's also about the kind of resources that we need to be able to monitor people that might be a danger at some point. But yes, it's a difficult question. And maybe third aspect about conquering hearts and the public, you know, policies regarding having people adhere to our values. Well, I think we're missing a good story, right? So like, how can we make people feel attracted to our kind of society? This is what is still missing, because yes, if people want to leave extremist organizations, we can give them a hand and can say, well, I can help you leave. I can protect you from your former buddies, but you need to believe in my story. You need to believe that this story is better than the story that you had before with ISIS, for example. And we have no answer yet, but maybe to be more optimistic to say is that the vast majority of people and the vast majority of Muslims all over Europe, you know, they are not violent. They're not, you know, believing in the story that ISIS tells them. So yes, we need a better story, but it's not that nobody believes in the story anymore. And it's also the question of how can those people that might feel neglected take part in building this story and a new story of European and democratic values.
Merci, Sophia Koller. Dr. Ali Al-Nouaimi, c'est à vous.
Dr. Ali Al-Nouaimi, go ahead, take it away.
Yes, well, you see,
Oui.
You need a story, as Sophia mentioned. I believe you have to use some of the Muslim community leaders and religious leaders and let them take the lead, you know, in approaching their community, you know, because those extremists and radicalized, they, you know, in their narrative, they use verses of the Quran, they use saying of the Prophet to approach, you know, the youth actually, and to recruit and for fundraising and, you know, for promoting their ideology. So you need to counter that ideology, you know, with some community leaders, religious leaders from the same community, and you encourage them. And this is where I believe, you know, you need a plan. You need a comprehensive, a national plan to do that. And I believe what's happening on Austria is a model. Because I was there before COVID-19 started, and I saw that they started having a plan, and they have the political will, they have the courage, and they use some of the community leaders, the Muslim leaders, you know, to take the lead in countering these you know, extremists in their community. You know, I just want to mention when it comes about ISIS, although, you know, we see that ISIS were defeated in their infrastructure in Iraq and Syria. But unfortunately, ISIS is still active, is still engaged, is still a threat. If you follow what's happening in Afghanistan, there is more than 10,000 ISIS terrorist fighters in North Afghanistan. And if you follow what's happening in the Sahel area and West Africa, you will see that ISIS is gaining every day because no one, you know, is there to counter them. So I don't want this just, you know, we see that we were able to destroy their infrastructure in Syria and Iraq, that we won the war. It's a long term, it's an ideology war also. So I don't want my European friend to feel that, you know, stay safe. No, ISIS is a threat. It's a danger. It's a danger to our national security, and it is also to your national security. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thomas Renard.
Thank you very much. Thomas Renard. Yes, thank you. Allow me to elaborate on 3 different aspects. I'll be quick. Firstly, needless to say, the panel members are inviting us to discuss the issues or the terms of de-radicalization and disengagement. And obviously, we need a broader perspective. And I started touching upon that when I spoke earlier. Let us not consider disengagement and disengagement policies as a miracle solution, as a silver bullet. Of course, we need to occupy that space and be more attentive and be more careful in terms of early detection of low intensity signs of radicalization. So our intelligence, disruptive. I'm using the English term here on purpose. And in recent years, what we've been seeing, I think, is extremely interesting. And it goes well beyond the mere idea of disengagement, even though I do believe that such disengagement programs are necessary. Let's remember that 10 years ago, in most European and Western countries, the fight against terrorism stopped as soon as the person was arrested, tried, convicted, and sent to jail, and then you forgot about it. But a lot of things were still happening behind the scenes, particularly in the prison environment. So I do believe that Hugo Micheron, in his analysis, are very, very interesting. And I do believe that he rightly says that we need to concern ourselves with what jihadis are saying, their strategy, their discourse. But to some extent, I pay close attention, and I'm actually very concerned about our own discourse and our own analysis. So it's not just about what they think they're doing, it's also about what we think and what we are doing during that phase during which the threat is waning. So how do we address that? How do we address this persisting threat? And this threat is here to stay for many, many years, maybe at a lower level than what happened in 2015 or 2016. Now, this threat is becoming manifold. There are other forms of extremism that are rising. And we said this at the end of the year 2000 already. Remember that feeling of anti-terror fatigue. All of a sudden, people wanted to look at other priorities and they put terrorism back on the back burner. But in recent years, we have developed expertise. We have learned a lot of things at a human level, at an institution level. So how do we make all of that expertise sustainable? That's a key aspect we need to address. That's a question we need to ask ourselves. Now, in terms of disengagement, at the individual level, at the personal level, needless to say, a number of individuals will never disengage. They will never de-radicalize. They will always remain loyal to their ideology, their network, their movement. At the end of the day, what is it that matters? Our priority is to reduce that pool of individuals who pose a threat for society. We want to minimize that pool as much as possible, and we want to maximize their opportunities to leave if they want to put violence aside and get out of this trap. Let's give them the tools they need to do that. And if we look back in history, in the history of Islamic terrorism, but other forms of terrorism as well, we find that the vast majority of individuals, whether voluntarily or not, depending on the circumstances, will on their own exit the trap of violence and terrorism. Now, this raises questions as well, but at the end of the day, it doesn't seem to be the driving factor here. But at the end of the day, people get out of terrorism without necessarily receiving help. And some of these individuals who leave that trap, who manage to exit that movement, become experts in terrorism, and they become white hats. And they are the guiding thread, aren't they? And they help bridge the gap between the different generations of terrorism. So the onus is on us to make sure that these individuals who serve as bridges actually fight the good fight. And we want to minimize that pool of potential recruits, and let's not give them the opportunity to remobilize or regroup. They have an ideology, they have the determination, but let's not help them or allow them the backdrop that they need in order to regain influence again. And I would like to wrap up with an example. It's one example among many, but in Belgium, for example, there is an individual who was convicted of terrorism. So radical left terrorism. He was sentenced and spent many years in jail. And when he got out of jail, he was still very radicalized. He never given up the struggle. He still raised his fist. But today, his discourse is no longer attractive. And so he can't seem to mobilize enough recruits or enough supporters or sympathizers to justify ultra-left violence. So we need to bear that in mind. Thank you. Hugo Micheron. Thank you for these questions. It's fascinating. I think we agree on at least one thing. Numbers matter. And there's something we disagree on. Jihadi reality, what does it mean? What does it represent? To keep things simple, between the 1990s and now, there have been a dozen or so European nationals involved in the different nebula, whether in Bosnia or in Chechnya or in Algeria. In the around 2015, there were 6,000 European nationals involved in the Syrian network only. This means this phenomenon has increased by a factor of 100. And Mr. Hecker rightly reminded us that there are 8,000 individuals which are flagged as active threats. Now, I'm not saying they're all terrorists. I'm not saying they're all going to act out and stage attacks, but you have 8,000 red lights. To me, it's a different ballgame. And very few political phenomena have seen such an exponential growth over the past 20 years. Now, in terms of challenge, is there anything that compares to that? Climate change, maybe. But the difference is that we have the IPCC reports on climate change and its repercussions. But as far as terrorism, we have yet to diagnose the situation. So it's a different scale. And this means the very nature of the phenomenon has changed. Now, this approach would be satisfactory if this were still the 1990s and we were just dealing with a few dozen cases, but not anymore. Not hundreds of militants and an ever-growing pool of potential recruits who are exposed to these ideas. And we're talking thousands and thousands of people. Now, getting back to what Mark Hecker was saying, I agree. Out of the 80 people that I met with, only 10 of them were hardcore ideologists. And that does not mean that the remaining 70 were all manipulated. No, there were just maybe a handful of them. And out of those 70 people, some of them said they carried and upheld the values of terrorism, and they pitted those values against the French values of democracy and freedom, etc. Therein lies the ambiguity. And it is because of this ambiguity that jihadism is spreading. In the prison system in particular, it resonates with a lot of the general population. Now, this phenomenon is not behind us. On the contrary, in terms of ideology, it's expanding. The threat is expanding. We're looking straight at it. We make the mistake of thinking that because there are fewer attacks, or because they are smaller, that jihadism is waning in Europe. No, on the contrary, nature abhors a vacuum, and because there's a vacuum, nature is going to fill it. So the political issue is just as tricky. Over the past 20 or 30 years, we have failed to fully appreciate the phenomenon. And I think we are making this very same mistake. We are minimizing what jihadism looks like in between attacks, and we're minimizing the threat during the quiescent phase just because it is less visible, just because they claim to be disengaged. No, they're just biding their time and waiting to be ready to stage further attacks. We need to bear that into account. And if this trend continues, we're not talking 1,000 or several thousands of individuals. We're talking dozens of thousands of individuals that we will need to manage. And that's going to be very tricky. Let me wrap up on one last thing. It's very important. And it ties in with the question that was put to us. There's a mistake we often make. I believe that terrorism is a security problem, yes, but jihadism is a political challenge for society at large. It's not just a security problem. And civil society tends to imbue too many responsibilities, imbues the government with too many responsibilities. It's up to society at large to get invested, to get mobilized, to understand what jihadism means, both in religious terms and also from a social and economic point of view. What's happening when a population is becoming disenfranchised more and more and nothing is being done about it? There are millions in Belgium, 80 million in Germany. Jihadism, which is a minority fringe in Islam, cannot resist that trend. Thank you very much. Let's wrap up this roundtable. How much longer do we have? Maybe 10 minutes. Okay. What you said, Mr. Michon, regarding the social perception and also looking at the problem from a societal point of view, and the fact that jihadism is gaining ground in disenfranchised neighborhood. Some politicians would say you're just making excuses for jihadism and terrorists. Mr. Renard, you talked about early detection earlier. And when we listen to you all, we assume that detection is getting better, that detection tools have gotten better. But what happens once you have detected the threat, whether one individual or several or a whole group of individuals? What method do you use in Belgium once that first approach is complete? Yes. Well, let me try and quickly describe the situation. This is what happened. As I said before, this is something that has grown at a local level when individuals started leaving for Syria in 2012, 2013. And the municipalities in Belgium that were being left by these individuals started to appreciate the extent of the problem. And those first individuals seem to come from the same neighborhoods. They seem to originate from the same municipalities. So first, there was an attempt to appoint an officer, a point person at the municipal level, somebody who would go out and reach out to people, because the families of the people who left for Syria, they wondered what's going on. They needed help. And we set up cells, local units in charge of what we call radicalization prevention. And we inspired ourselves from different models in the Netherlands and Denmark and the UK. And so in Belgium today, we have in most municipalities which have been or are still being faced with radicalization problems, we have teams. So it may be just one person in radicalization problems. Now, mostly religious or Islamist radicalization problems. And these teams try to listen to what's happening. Now, we're not talking intelligence services. Most of the time, these are people who are social workers. They have that background in social mediation, and they listen to what people have to say, whether sports clubs or citizens or local schools, etc. So the issues are addressed as part of multi-institutional roundtables where representatives of the different city municipal departments come together. Okay, the school system talk to us about this particular student, which may pose a problem, etc. And if a determination is made that this is a social problem, then it'll be addressed as such. And municipal services will address the problem as a social issue. But if we think there's the potential for radicalization and the risk of violence, of course, the problem will be escalated to a different level. So in parallel, there's a security roundtable taking place, and intelligence services and the prosecution services are involved in the discussion. So a lot of evidence, as much evidence as possible, is gathered on this particular case, and a decision is made. An approach is decided. Do we adopt a security angle, or do we de-escalate back to the municipal level? Because intelligence services have access to much more information and evidence than the first level, right? Who act at the prevention level. So if intelligence services de-escalate back down to the municipal level and say, no, not really a threat, this person isn't actually radicalized and is not going to act out, back to the social level. But if a security approach is necessary, then it is taken. And if we believe there is a true imminent risk, then we escalate to the third level. It's a real-time information exchange platform between judicial services, intelligence services, and in real time, all of the information is put on the table. This happened, for example, following the attacks in Brussels in March. So this is a unique system, the ability to bring together all of the different intelligence services, so everybody can have the same level of information, everybody can be on the same page, so we can address the terrorist threat effectively and efficiently. So this is our system. There are other systems, obviously, but this is how we operate. We have different levels, and we can escalate or de-escalate a case depending on the level of threat. Thank you. Dr. Ali Al-Nuaimi, earlier, there was talk of opportunities that can be presented to those individuals who want to do away with violence. For example, somebody who's a drug addict may want to stop doing drugs and they want to go to rehab, and we need to present them with that opportunity. Okay, so if we want to, how can we use this rationale when we bear in mind that a lot of individuals who have been jihadis and they grew up in Europe and they see jihadism as a form of, and I'm using air quotes here, as they see it as atonement, as expiation, as redemption relative to their dissolute past lives. So Mr. Renard talked about opportunities for disengagement that they need to be provided to those individuals. How do we make that happen when they join jihad voluntarily because they see it as redemption regarding their past lives?
Well, you see, the best model.
Le meilleur modèle que j'ai vu de ce point de vue, c'est celui qui a été mis en place à Singapour. Ce n'est pas de la responsabilité d'un conseiller de faire un jugement, mais c'est la famille de la personne, les dirigeants communautaires, les dirigeants religieux, les responsables publics dans un processus à long terme pour s'assurer que cette personne est sérieuse et aussi que la communauté accepte cette personne. Parfois, on pourra avoir quelqu'un qui est véritablement prêt à quitter la radicalisation et sa propre histoire, mais il sent que sa communauté ne l'accepte pas en tant que nouvelle personnalité. Et c'est là qu'il faut mettre au travail aussi les membres de sa famille, les dirigeants religieux, les dirigeants sociaux, communautaires, et pour qu'ils arrivent graduellement à intégrer, qui puisse l'aider lui à intégrer sa famille et sa communauté. Parce que si la communauté ne l'accepte pas, eh bien, il va retourner vers la radicalisation. Ce n'est pas le rôle de l'État ou de la municipalité, c'est le rôle de la famille, des dirigeants communauté, de sa famille au sens large, au sein de cette communauté, d'être des parties prenantes engagées dans ce processus.
Merci. Quelqu'un veut-il réagir à ce que vient de dire le docteur Noémie à propos justement de l'importance, ou pas, à vous d'en décider, de la présence et de l'intervention de
What's the importance of the presence of religious leaders in the disengagement or in de-radicalization, whatever? Who wishes to answer this question about the presence of religious leaders there? Zofia Colas.
Yes, I would like to react, but on another aspect, because we're talking about, or Dr. Ali said he, you know, so yes, the vast majority that we're speaking of from extremists, but of course, as one of the few women in this round, it's of course also kind of my responsibility to point out the role of women in extremism and also the aspect of formers, because women are stigmatized, because entering extremism, that's already a no-go, from the perspective of society in many cases, but then returning to their communities and trying to reintegrate in many senses, again, like very much connected to stigma. So I think this, maybe following up on what Hugo Michon said, is that this is something that we are still very much, very early in our understanding of how women enter extremism and also exit extremism, because it seems to be different and then again similar to what men experience. So I think that also in the whole term of what does it mean for exit work? What does it mean for intelligence services? I think this is something that we really should focus on, especially considering that, for example, risk assessments, they're based on experiences with men. So we don't really know if they're working for women. And another aspect is that we now have a panel on cyber jihadism, if I recall correctly. So what we see from practitioners is that the target group that is radicalizing online are young girls, not young boys. So this is a whole new challenge. It's a whole new question of what will be the next target group and how will we deal between this, online and offline connect. So I think this is something that I would like to point out in this round as well, because we have not really talked about it thus far. Thank you.
Alors, ça va être un petit peu.
It's going to be complex. Just one last question, suggested by a journalist, Harold Hyman, but not foreign to your topic. Mark, imam used as in-betweens, who are supposed in the mind of some reps, for France, about what should be called Islam of France. Harold Hyman is asking, are those imams, how should I say, sure, certain, safe, or are they threatened by the jihadists for their in-between or go-between work? The answer, yes, they are threatened because they're regarded as blue, white, red imams collaborating with the government. Are they credible because they are already working with the government? Are they credible or trustworthy by the radicalized people? And there is a proportion of the public at the lowest end of the spectrum. And it depends about the individuals. There's a certain amount of clergymen engaged about those issues who successfully had an efficient action versus the people in prison. And for some others, it's totally not working. We can adopt the rationale of Hugo about the ideologists against the others. And the disengagement of the program should be a tool among others in the whole ecosystem of the struggle. And it's also the justice and the action of the civil society. The problem of the state, when we talk about programs and we talk about public action of the government, how can a government trigger a mobilization of the civil society for some of those communities? There were some attempts with the foundation of the Islam of France. It was not the first attempt, but it's not conclusive for the time being. So if we take the matrix of Hugo, and maybe you can ask him this question, I would like to speak instead of you, Mr. Rybinski. If we take the perspective of Hugo, What are the recommendations in terms of public policy? Hugo? Thank you for this question. The way I see things is not to oppose a program against another program. It's not my role as a researcher. I'm more useful to the collectivity trying to document and take part into the collective assessment about the topic. What seems to me important to understand is not to insist upon the ideologists and to oppose them to rank and file soldiers. What's important is to understand the dynamic of what we are working on. Of women in this panel, I wish to commend the work of Géraldine Cazut on the engagement of the female jihadists. And the issue of female jihadists is typical of what we're missing collectively, because there was no female jihadism 20 years ago. There were women here and there. It was a very reduced amount, but since the appearance of ISIS, we have European women who by hundreds engage in jihadism, and it changes everything. It changes the whole dynamic of the movement, because it's now at the family unit. Children will grow up with a certain amount of values attached to the jihadi ideology. So quite clearly, there's going to be a small group as a family group, not as an individual. If we do not step back and we don't think, we can multiply talks with women, but we miss the real role in the structuring of the movement. What I think about public policy, I see that we are late in the production of knowledge. We multiply what we know how to do. Top-down decision from the state, multiplying the pyramidal approach. But at a given time, people will have to understand the importance of the issue, and groups of the civil society should mobilize through the citizenship tools, but more individuals that will be interested to the causes and try to document this phenomenon, because the diagnosis is far from being definitive, finalized. And this is impossible without a national effort, and highlight the effort if we multiply the statement saying that disengagement and radicalization is done by a certain amount of groups is enough, is the solution, then we shall discourage a certain amount of individuals who would be interested in understanding the phenomenon. As long as we say that it's one of the solution among others, but for the time being we say we don't have the rest of the solutions. Thank you, Hugo Micheron. Thanks to all of you. We must conclude now. I take away from what you said, all of you, this necessity of involvement of the civil society that will obviously not be relevant only to those who are Muslim or of Arab origin or of Muslim origin. This is not the case. Thank you so much for all of you, and I give back the floor to David Kreiter.
Merci beaucoup, Gauthier.
Thank you, Gauthier, and all the members of the panel, with a very interesting panel, and makes things even more complex, but we learned a lot, like each and every time. There will be a debrief, and there will be a replay for each and every one to be able to listen to all the presentations, and we will come up with a digest. In the conclusion, your conclusion, like Hugo Micheron said, indeed, jihadi is a political issue. Let's not hide behind our pinkies. And the jihadis is a minority, of course, but they are facing hundreds of millions of Europeans who would be decided to face them. Indeed, it's in this dynamic that we put ELNET, and the Institut Montaigne and Hans Seidel Stiftung, our enemies are only strong because of our weaknesses. Yes, to this idea that we should develop this work. The terrorism is a security issue, yes, but it's also a political issue. To connect with the next table, we have a witness, a keynote speaker, Rashid Benzin, who published several books asking what is the place of Islam within the Republic and the French society. He is a fellow searcher at the Paul Ricoeur Center in Paris. Rashid Benzin will talk about the counter speech and the religious referent. And this will be a very good introduction to the next panel. Mr. Rashid Benzin, you have the floor. Thank you for your invitation. Regarding the suggestion I wish to make in a couple of minutes is to start and understand why young people all around the world were caught in by a narrative. The narrative is very important, and I worked for a year and a half in the French prisons and in Belgium, where I met several jihadis, male and female, as of 2015. And what I took away from it is that the strength of Daesh, of ISIS, is that they suggested a political and religious narrative. Both dimensions should be taken into account. It's a theological and political narrative articulated on 4 mythologies or dreams, or dreams, so to speak. Very important. The first dream is the dream of unity, unity of the Muslim world. There is something that is creating a community, a kind of community of destiny, of fate. Everybody is a brother and a sister, and this dream of unity wishes to go back to what used to be the Muslim empire in history, but also to question all the splicing of this world. So this dimension of unity, this dimension of recognition, of emotional recognition, what makes it that this narrative, when it was spelled out, made that those individuals felt recognized. So this issue of unity. Second point, it's dignity. I think we're not sensitive enough to the humiliation. Humiliation always prepares the violence of the future. When there's no social recognition, when there's no justice. I remember a sentence said by a jihadi that I wrote in terms of fiction. It's the sentence saying, you can repair an injustice, but you do not heal of a humiliation. And since humiliation prepares the ground for violence, how can feel humiliated when there is a speech that recognizes you, it prepares action. Third dream is purity. Purity that will build the them and us. It's really a question to ask how far we can create this us. There's the us of the Mujahideen, of the Muslims, of Islam, between those who are Muslims and those who are not Muslims. Them, the Crusader, the Westerners, the renegades. We can talk about this issue of purity. There is a link between purity and purification. During the 20th century, in the name of a Nazi ideology that was talking about a race purity, others were regarded as not pure. And the move to violence was part of an action towards purification. And the fourth is the eschatological one, the meaning. Many young ones, for a lack of meaning to their life, wanted to give a meaning to their death. And those 4 dimensions should question us politically in order to develop what should be a public policy of recognition. bearing on the works of Paul Ricoeur on how to recognize, and Axel Ronet about the struggle for recognition. One of the supposition on the base is the essential part of the subjective aspect of the individual, and also the vulnerability, ontological vulnerability. The construction of identity goes through recognition, and recognition is an action where individuals will attribute to themselves the mutually moral qualities, meaning that the relation of a positive relation to oneself goes through the recognition of oneself by the other and by the institutions. And this is something that is base, and you see it in the work that we're leading today through Sylvie, starting from the basis, how institution can appear that as being humiliating, producing despise and humiliation. What is logical is when you ask a certain amount of officers within the institution, they feel themselves humiliated. So how can you work about that, about humiliation? Regarding the religious work, we heard a certain amount of sociologists saying that they had a small knowledge of religion. The issue seems, did we ask the Marxists if they read Karl Marx, if they understood? No, what was important, it's not the knowledge of the religions, why this kind of speech makes a sense, has a meaning. And this is what we have to understand. How does the religious language function? We became analphabets. In order to take the religious discourse for its substance, trying to bring this on social problems, political, psychological, and psychoanalytical issues. The religious speech has its own specificity because it can articulate what I call a debt of meaning between the one who says the words and those receiving the words. When we are working on the prophetic discourse or religious discourse of all the texts, there is a unconditional recognition given by God to the believer once he gets into the alliance. This unconditional alliance is very important. So at a given time, the young generation can recognize themselves in the prophets, in the prophetical figures, in what is being told. It's a speech that is being going in toward action. It's a performative action, giving meaning to the political, economic situation of what is regarded as the Muslim community. And it has a geopolitical vision which is rested on the eschatology. But if you do not have the religious understanding, it leads to a conspirationist speech. From a religious point of view, there are two elements. There's the work from the human sciences and also about theology inside Islam to show the different versions of theology all through history, and get out from a eternal Islam that would have existed from forever, and moving from an authentic or wrong or true Islams. Those are conflicts of interpretation. What's very important from a theological point of view is to show in what Wittgenstein calls games of language or interpretation games, and helping to show how within Islam there are traditions, various traditions, reopen the plurality within a tradition without being able to leading the soft sciences, history, anthropology, of whatever. And you have to work on the history of the representations and the representations and the imagination, because there is a kind of substitution of the imagination where today several young people, when they have access to the text, substitute their own imagination and put it in the text. You have to humanize the beliefs, and you have to come up with history. History is one time, one place, one human group. And we annihilate the chronology in the ideology, and the work of hermeneutics in believers and non-believers is absolutely basic. So what I would say to conclude, because I have 2 or 3 minutes left, is that we need to work on this notion of recognition, the various forms of recognition that were differentiated by the various authors enables us to understand that the condition of identity, the way an identity is built in the narrative meaning of Paul Ricoeur, is intersubjective, where the human subjects are being built, and that as a counterpoint of this non-recognition, there is a rationale of despise, which is a negative way. Violence, deprivation of rights, humiliation, offenses, preparing the ground for violence. I would conclude by saying that a quote from Paul Ricoeur, and one Axel Honneth and one of Paul Ricoeur, saying we can talk about social pathology when the subjects are not accessing collectively to the specification of recognition, and we can talk about social injustice when the subjects are excluded from a practice guaranteeing freedom. And this quote of Paul Ricoeur saying, it's a good life in institutions which are righteous. How to develop the self-esteem and the esteem of the others in the institution, and from a theological point of view, what is to be worked on is the alterity, the otherness within the Islamic field. And the last sentence, in the opposite of knowledge is not ignorance, but certainties, and instillate a little bit of doubt in our analysis would be very good for all of us. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Rashid. I'm very glad to have devoted to you this keynote speech about the violence and the eruption of violence. So that's the end of the sequence. Thank you again. Thank you, Rashid Benzine, for accepting our invitation. And I leave the floor to Julia Obermeier of the Hans Seidel Foundation for this third part about cyber jihadism.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you also on behalf of Hans Seidel Foundation for the opportunity to co-host this summit. Fighting cyber jihadism effectively is a challenge for every state, and especially for a democratic state. The most efficient method in place for jihadists today to organize and finance themselves, to recruit, and also to spread their propaganda is the internet. So fighting jihadism in the internet is a priority. Material and disturbing recordings, such as execution videos. To identify those responsible and stop funding, and to switch off artificial bots and hate speech on the internet, recognizing and preventing social networks and rings. For a constitutional state, the trade-off and successful fight against terrorism and crime is difficult. The state can only fight against what it has knowledge of. But in order to know what's going on, the state needs to be able to intervene in the personal rights of the person concerned. And the state needs a complete toolkit. Even this, but when I cannot prove that this person finances the jihad, since all communication is encrypted, what can I do? Or the other way around, what's the point if I identify the call for violence, but do not know where the person behind this is because they hide their position through Tor networks? Therefore, the complete arsenal of tools is needed. Well developed in the country in which I'm currently located, and can also be bought for state institutions in Europe. There is a long list of tools. I want to briefly discuss a few important skills. Number one, OSINT, open source intelligence. Programs through which I can monitor the darknet, follow discussions there and find out, for example, who is the operator of a website. Or I can synchronize accounts, identify accounts, locate servers and track topics. Second, skills to penetrate networks. These can be Trojan horses, which penetrate cell phones and computers, ideally in zero-click technology, which can read out messages, track, and if needed, take over chat groups and Twitter accounts. Geolocators, which record positions, movement fields, and heat maps, and forensic tools that restore deleted files or destroyed data. And also hacking of routers, surveillance cameras, or vehicles. Which dominate up to 80% of chats in the internet nowadays. Fourth, conventional ways such as blocking Twitter and Facebook accounts or deactivating websites. And five, last but not least, the financing. Follow the money. In the future, we will be troubled by cryptocurrencies and their anonymity and blockchain technology. Here as well, strong OSINT tools are definitely required to help clarify the context of such transactions and find out who is behind it. All of these toolkits are already available. But in order to be able to fight cyber jihadism effectively, the legal authorities need not only the experts and the technical tools, but also the corresponding laws. And unfortunately, the fact that in many cases, state security authorities are not allowed to use such tools is mercilessly exploited. And as former member of the Bundestag, I'm very aware that it's a difficult trade-off between individual data protection and the fight against terrorism, but it's a necessary one. Thank you very much. Now I'm looking forward to the round table and hand over to Etienne Jacob. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Julia. Bonjour à tous. Alors, tout d'abord, je voudrais vraiment remercier.
Thank you very much, Julia. Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks to ELNET, the Montaigne Institute, for inviting me. Many thanks also to David Kalfa for his conference. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person in future editions. Now, before discussing the topic of this roundtable, how to fight cyber jihadism, and to give you all the floor, I would like to share with you a quick story which may prove useful to this discussion. Julia touched upon that a little bit. In 2017, I discovered the existence of cryptocurrencies, and it was a parallel world where everybody dreamt of becoming rich. A parallel world because in this field, anonymity is king, and very often the creators of these virtual currencies communicate with their investors via parallel channels. So you got Twitter for official information, but to find out the latest news, or even to talk directly with the founders of these currencies, you need encrypted messaging apps like Telegram. And I was very interested in one of these currencies, and I found myself on a Telegram channel chatting with investors who were waiting to know whether the price was going to go up or whether it was going to go down. And all of a sudden, the Telegram channel was stormed. It was stormed by individuals who started posting flags of Islamic State and photos of executions and untold violence, voice memos containing those infamous nasheeds, those poems that have become anthems for terrorists. And this attack was particularly shocking for me, and it caught me off guard. And after a few days, I realized that those attacks were a regular thing on many Telegram chat channels. Was it a recruiting method? Maybe. Well, at the time, Islamic State still had a strong position on the ground. I'm a journalist, that's my job. Obviously, I decided to dig deeper, and I decided to go and talk to some of the perpetrators of these cyber attacks. And I tried to talk to a man who claimed to be on the ground in Raqqa, in Syria, and he was cursing us, Western dogs. And the discussion lasted a few days. And he told me he was taking up arms every day, and he sent me a few voice memos, and then he stopped answering. Now, whatever his fate, these short conversations meant one thing. These cyber jihadis, well, as far as this individual is concerned, he also appeared to be a jihadi on the ground. These people are not robots. These are soldiers who are eager to lure specific types of people, specific profiles. Now, today, Islamic State has significantly retreated on the ground, so they have fallen back on the internet, and they continue to pose a threat to the West, but also to Africa and to Asia. But on the World Wide Web, whether we're talking Al-Qaeda or ISIS, seem much more difficult to catch. Despite the efforts of major platforms to curb their actions, and despite government efforts to sanction this propaganda, where do we stand? What is the state of the threat? And what can we do to contain it? And these are the questions that you will try to answer today. Now, before we get the roundtable started, I'd like to introduce to you the various participants. Tonight, we have with us Laurence Weiner, co-founder of the JAWS project, a platform that analyzes terrorist propaganda. You look at terrorist rhetoric. You're part of the executive steering committee of the UN. You're also an associate researcher at the Global Network. Hello, Laurence Weiner. We're also welcoming Anthony Samaris, Director for Terrorist Propaganda Analysis at Europol's ECTC, the European Counterterrorism Center. You supervised surveillance analysis of online jihadi content, and you started your career as an investigator, right? You investigated terrorism, and you've been with Europol since 2014. Hello, Denise. Let's also welcome Aaron Saltman, Director of Programs at the Global Internet Center for Counterterrorism. Previously, you served as, you were the head of counterterrorism for the Middle East and Africa. You worked with multiple stakeholders. You developed programs to fight radicalization together with Facebook, NGOs. You deal with jihadi extremism, but also left, right, or far right extremism. Let's also welcome Nicolas Guidou, Deputy Director of the Fight Against Cybercrime with the DCPJ. Benjamin Audaille is a historian that specializes in Islam in France and Europe, working at the Montaigne Institute. You've been working with the Montaigne Institute since 2016. And lastly, Ezra Sarr. Hello, Ezra. You're a researcher. You work at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, IDC, Herzliya in Israel. Before joining us, you served in leadership positions as part of Israel's security institutions for 32 years. You're an expert in intelligence against the Palestinian terrorism, international cooperation. You also enrolled in the Israeli army. Hello, Ezra. So a quick reminder of the rules. We have a couple of minutes per speaker, a first roundtable of 5 minutes, and then a second roundtable. A few questions from journalists, and then a last roundtable, and we will wrap up on hands-on proposals, how to contain the jihadi threat. Ladies first, Laurence Weiner, co-founder of the JAWS project. So what does the threat look like right now? Why are we still interested in jihadi threats on the internet? Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Let's review the online jihadi landscape. What form does it take, and why are we still taking an interest? Well, we're still interested because over 2 years after Islamic State's defeat on the ground, ISIS still exists. And it connects supply and demand for ideology. And despite the disappearance of this sanctuary, we often talk about Islamic State, but there are lots of groups and they're still recruiting, they're still influencing people, they're still encouraging individuals to take action and act out. One caveat as this roundtable begins. I believe that there is a preconception that still prevails, and we need to take it with a pinch of salt. One does not become radicalized on their own behind their computer. Okay, social media and the internet are not the start all and end all of radicalization. They're not the alpha and omega of radicalization. During the previous roundtable, we saw that radicalization is a complex phenomenon with multiple different factors. And depending on your journey, it'll be religious, social, family, repercussions or implications. And so in the midst of all this, needless to say, propaganda and consumption of propaganda can act as a driver. It can fast track radicalization, but generally speaking, you need a prerequisite before a person acts out in almost all cases. Propaganda is consumed. It is a catalyst for acting out. But for that, you need to understand supply and demand behaviors. It is absolutely crucial to look at what drives supply and demand for ideology. You need to look at what drives it because this is where those groups roll out a well thought out strategy. So with the emergence of Islamic State, which really set the stone in terms of propaganda, they had a twofold objective. Number one, they wanted to become the leading brand on the jihadi market. They wanted to impose their brand as the place to go, and they also wanted to populate the caliphate on the ground. And to that end, they set up propaganda, mass consumption propaganda. So up until then, you needed to go get Al Qaeda's propaganda. You need to go fetch it. You need to. And so there are several key success factors we need to consider. First of all, it's massive. From a quantitative point of view, this propaganda is massive and easy to access using social media platforms. And it's also accessible because it's the content is translated in many different languages, so people can embrace it, appropriate it. So volume, accessibility, a variety of different media or materials, video, audio, etc. And needless to say, this is fed by a very powerful rhetoric. So the caliphate as a utopia, a place where you can truly embody your own brand of Islam, a place where you can be yourself. So attractive and repulsion. You are fighting, by bringing about the caliphate, you are fighting against the Western liberal model. And this is part and parcel of the propaganda. Muslims are victims. They are unable to truly live out Islam. Hence the need for systematic racism. On top of that, there's ultra-violence and increased media coverage of that ultra-violence. So where do we stand today? Well, there have been encouraging developments, but there are also causes for concern, which we will discuss later. So the volume has gone down significantly. We're seeing a contraction in the quantity and the quality of the propaganda out there. Now, thanks to institutions and public authorities, whether at government level, at country level, or at a member state level, or at the EU level, the the surface of contact between the propaganda and the final consumers has been much reduced since 2015, and also thanks to a number of operations, particularly in 2019, when Europol staged that operation. Dissemination of this propaganda is much more fragmented, much more restricted to little used platforms. So a contraction in quality, in quantity, accessibility, etc. Now, on the negative side, in terms of production, they may be working in degraded mode, but Islamic State continues to recycle old content, so they're still out there and they're still generating and recycling content. In terms of dissemination, what do we see? We're seeing the emergence of new platforms that were little known up until now, decentralized web platforms, and you can compare them with areas, spaces without central governance, which means it's easier for these unlawful, illicit contents to stay there for longer periods of time. And on a regular basis, there are campaigns, lots of campaigns on a number of key themes. And this will feed into publication and republication. For example, the women as prisoners, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, COVID, Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. So different themes feed into that propaganda. And so the debate has become more brutal, and the window of acceptability for the violence, the online violence, is widening, is getting bigger and bigger. I think my time is up. We can also discuss the different aspects of fighting against this during Q&A. Thank you very much, Laurence Weiner. Now handing over to Antonis Simoris. Please share with you your expertise at the European level. You are a member of Europol, are you not?
Thank you for the invitation. It's an absolute honor for me to have the opportunity to present the work we do in Europol in this summit. To start with, I think I need to mention that the recent attacks in Europe have drastically changed the response, the European Union's response, to the terrorist threat. And for us in Europol to streamline resources and effectively address terrorism, we set up the European Counterterrorism Center, the ECTC. And that was in January 2016. The ECTC shares a number of key objectives. First, to serve as a European information hub for counterterrorism. Second, to provide effective operational support and expertise in member state investigations. Third, to mitigate the use of the internet and social media for terrorist purposes. And fourth, to promote collaborative work with international partners, including the tech industry. With regard to the jihadists, that jihadist terrorism in the EU continues to be influenced by developments abroad. The so-called Islamic State, for instance, continues to actively reach out to supporters in Europe to incite to perpetrate attacks. And at the same time, Islamic State operatives in detention camps and prisons in northeastern Syria continue to hold hundreds of individuals with links to Europe. As regards Al-Qaeda, despite the fact that the terrorist organization lost important leadership figures in 2020, its regional affiliates continue to exploit local grievances and absence of governance to survive and maintain operational capabilities. And towards the West and the Europe in particular, Al-Qaeda retains its aggressive attitude and incites lone actor attacks. And in this context, jihadist organizations continue to invest heavily in online strategic communications, aiming at radicalizing, recruiting, and eventually mobilizing supporters. So I had to turn the sound off. Sorry for that. It is true that faced with the loss of territorial control in Syria and Iraq and the killing of of key media operatives, the Islamic State official propaganda machinery witnessed in the last couple of years a decline in official propaganda. We concur with Laurence in this assessment. And the decrease in the volume of this type of propaganda was noticeable in particular for specific products. For instance, the video releases by the self-proclaimed Islamic State provinces, or the official endorsed media outlets such as Al-Hayat media, which used to be highly influential in the past. Nonetheless, IS supporters managed to compensate for this reduction in official propaganda by cycling old content and producing new releases, especially images, PDF publications, audiovisual material inciting to violence. And this type of productions experienced a spike of activity in the aftermath of terrorist attacks that took place in Europe in 2020. In particular, IS supporter networks have gone to great lengths to amplify the threat messages against the EU countries. In this regard, IS supporter networks acquire a prominent role in the dissemination of terrorist content online and the terrorist threat landscape. And lately, it is again the IS supporters online who have tried to come up with circumvention measures in order to regain digital ground and avoid suspensions. To address the online terrorist threat, the ECTC works together with key partners, including EU member states, EU institutions, and the tech industry. And specifically within the ECTC, the EU Internet Referral Unit coordinates the detection of terrorist and violent extremist online content with relevant common authorities in EU member states. At the same time, we carry out referrals of terrorist content in close cooperation with the tech industry and, of course, with respect to fundamental rights. As an indication, over the past 6 years, the EURU has assessed over 130,000 pieces of jihadist terrorist content located in 361 online platforms. At the same time, the unit coordinated 20 referral action days targeting terrorist content online with the participation of EU member states, third countries with an operational agreement with Europol, and online service providers. In addition, the unit supports member states' internet-based investigations and supports member states in the field of electronic evidence. In this regard, the strategic goal of the EURU is to bridge the gap between prevention and investigation in the area of city online. And of course, tackling the terrorist use of the internet is a collaborative effort involving key actors such as governments and the tech industry. And I would like to conclude with that because we value a lot the public-private partnership. And as I said, Europol plays a central role and important role in bringing this capacity together in order to fight the online jihadism. So I would like to conclude the intervention at this point, and of course I'm happy to take any questions later on.
Merci beaucoup, Antonis. Je donne maintenant la parole à Erin.
Thank you very much, Antonis. Now handing over to Eric Saltman. Let's discuss GAFANs in particular.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And if it's useful, I'll share just a couple of slides just to give some visual context. And sometimes what we talk about can be a little bit confusing in the online space. Obviously, working with the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, we're a little bit of a unique body because we were originally founded by tech companies for tech companies. And this really came off the back of entities like the EU Internet Forum or the UN Counterterrorism Executive Directorate and others constantly having to bring different tech platforms to the table to say, hey, we're seeing these trends, what are you doing about it? And there was increased recognition that just like the fact that Islamist extremist jihadism or even white supremacy neo-Nazism is never just in one country, it's transnational. And in the online space, we realize it's also cross-platform. Nothing is just on one platform. And increasingly, tech companies had to start looking at each other and working with each other to follow trends. And to Laurence's point of needing open source intelligence and actually needing to track trends, we realized that there were kind of 3 original main questions we need to answer in order to be effective, and a 4th question that emerged in the aftermath of the New Zealand Christchurch attacks. You know, the first question is, Where can we share technology? Where can tech companies share tooling across platforms that is also with respect to privacy and some of the points that Julia pointed out earlier? What can we do, but not at the cost of human rights? Where can we get better action-oriented research? So not just long research that maybe looks at a whole year and says more research is needed, but very short, quick pieces of insights that tech companies can act on very quickly, because this adversarial shift happens very fast online. A third question was then, how can we share knowledge between our sectors? Tech companies have visibility to very different trends compared to Antonius at Europol or law enforcement agencies, or even compared to researchers that might be doing investigations of their own. And then, of course, after the Christchurch, New Zealand attack, when we saw the exploitation of live streaming during an ongoing real-world threat, we had to question, well, how as a group of tech companies do we come to terms with crisis response? What does that look like when that traditionally has been a role of governments? And now tech companies have to have their own protocols that can fit in line with government actions. Just to confuse you, here's a little bit of an organizational structure of what GIFCT looks like. But I think it's important because we need not just the tech companies as sort of an operating core, but we also needed an independent advisory committee that included government entities like the European Commission, the UK, US, Canadian government, Ghana and Japan, so that we don't have just a Western bias when we're tackling these issues, but then that is outnumbered by a group of civil society experts and human rights activists to make sure that when we consider some of these big moves, that we're not doing it at the cost of other liberties. And we use that to kind of bring together multi-stakeholder forums and programs and working groups to solve around very specific topics as we go. And as we know in this field, none of these topics are easy and there's never just one solution, but we need to kind of hash out what's feasible and what can we move on quickly versus what might need to be teased out over time. And when we see where this began with kind of the 4 founding companies that everyone's heard of, you know, Microsoft, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, we started to see this membership grow out in a way where maybe these are not all the usual platforms you think of when you think of terrorist exploitation. All of these platforms applied for GIFCT membership, of which there's a criteria of a few points, including you need to have an annual transparency report to join. You need to have a fundamental commitment to human rights. You need to have explicit terms of service that actually say it's illegal to promote terrorist or violent extremist content on your platform. A lot of tech platforms do not have that. So these are the types of companies that are coming to the table looking for support. Some of them are what we think of when we think of traditional social media, but increasingly it's not. Increasingly, we're seeing companies start trying to join that are more from financial tech or marketplaces or where you go to book rooms or transportation. And all of these tools are exploited in different ways by terrorists and violent extremists. So we need to diversify how we think of exploitation and solve for what tools are available because of that type of exploitation. So really all of our work is divided into 3 pillars: prevention, response, and learning. When we think of prevention for civil society, traditionally that has been about looking at counter narratives or contre-discours, alternative narratives, ways that we can push back and create resiliency online to extremist content. So we do have programs and campaign toolkits to support that development for civil society. Prevention means something very different to a tech company. Prevention for a tech company usually means stopping the viral spread of something, preventing a piece of campaigned content from a terrorist to go further. One of the things GIFCT launched in 2017 was a hash sharing database where we could take known pieces of terrorist content and hash them to turn them into what is a digital fingerprint so that it does not include personally identifiable information and it's an indicator of content. And then a tech company can use that to proactively try to surface where that content is shared on their platform. So it's a way of safely and without violating privacy, try to share signals to find terrorist content. Now, again, why public-private partnerships and government partnerships are important. Obviously, there is no one agreed upon definition of terrorism, and this looks very different all around the world. To start with, this database uses the UN designated list, but we're doing a huge process with externals right now to see where we can advance that taxonomy, recognizing that it's not just Islamist extremist jihadists, it's also neo-Nazi related and white supremacy related terrorism that we are increasingly facing as we look at case studies. So we think then to response, what can we do in a real world crisis when tech companies are implicated? And we have started developing out a communication framework and incident response framework so that tech companies can share open source intelligence very quickly, make awareness that an event is happening. And in the cases where there is a live streaming, like the Christchurch attack, of that content with each other to stop the viral spread. We have triggered what we call a content incident protocol twice since the New Zealand attack, and that was in the Halle, Germany attacks, as well as the Glendale, Arizona attacks. And in both cases, live streaming during the real world attack by the perpetrator was involved in this. And again, we have a working group on crisis response, and we've been very grateful to have Europol at the table with other law enforcement to try to work out how to make that communication process and that data sharing process easier and better facilitated as it expands. And then again, every time we face a crisis, every time we see an adversarial shift, we really need to document and learn from it. GiveCT supports the global network on extremism and technology, of which Jihadiscope has contributed, and we're very grateful for that. And literally every week, GNet comes out with small, quick insights to help tech companies understand where adversarial shifts are. It talks about blockchain, it talks about QAnon and misinformation, adversarial shifts about the types of platforms that might be used. And increasingly, we're seeing things just like the fact that when we think a tech company can just algorithm and create a solution without knowing the trends and parameters to create that tooling infrastructure, it's pretty useless. So we do see, when we think about the future, we know that it's not just about photo and video matching. In the future, we do see some tech companies using things like logo detection, audio detection, network analysis, and strategic takedown of networks. We also see different types of signals around terrorist finance, which was mentioned earlier. And I think now the question is, where can you share it across platforms? How do you create an infrastructure to share signals in a way that does not abuse privacy laws or human rights? And so I think to finish going forward, the big questions will be around these adversarial shifts, and it will take a lot of government dialogue to see where are we solving for privacy, where are we solving for security, and where are we solving for free speech. And these three pillars often contradict each other. If you solve for one, it is often at the cost of the other two. So it's about navigating a line between them. And the other question will be, you know, we can bring companies to the table. We have members, we have infrastructure, but there are also companies that do not want to come to the table. You know, our Europol representative mentioned that they have flagged content to 361 different platforms. I showed you a slide with 17 member platforms. So you will see that some companies want to find help and want to be part of the dialogue. You will also see companies that do not want to be part of the dialogue, that do not want to censor content at all on their platforms. And so it will be up to governments in the future and policymakers to see, what do we do with those platforms when we can create some spaces to bring people to the table, but what do we do for those that will remain abusive platforms in the future? I'll stop there, but I think there's so much that we could talk about.
Merci beaucoup, Erin, pour vos mots.
Thanks, Erin. Benjamin Odaye, the cyber jihad, from a historical point of view, this turning point about the jihadism on the internet. Hello, I'm very glad to be present here. Thanks the organizers and the speakers. It was very interesting to hear you. I'll articulate my words in a few steps. I'll track back about the last decade to see what has been the role of the internet in the engagement of European jihadists, especially the French one. And then I'll make some remarks about the current situation. Stepping back last decade about the terrorist waves and jihadi engagement that struck Europe since 2012, we have to take into account cyber radicalization, but not reduce everything to the internet and to the propaganda online. We discussed in the media about self-radicalization, express radicalization behind a screen with a young girl that would be radicalized on her own in her room behind a screen. Those arguments were used a lot by their lawyers, according to the testimony of their parents, who think they know what their daughters are doing inside the room, but do not know what they are doing outside. Same goes for the boys. Though the influence of propaganda, it had an influence, of course. I agree with what Laurence said earlier. When we take stock of the jihadi commitments in Europe since 2012, like we did with Hakim el-Karoui in the book you quoted for the Montaigne Institute, there are examples of young girls, of people who radicalized mainly online, but we have to give more importance to the performative importance to propaganda, meaning because you watch propaganda, you turn into a jihadist. We have to take into account several things, a kind of dynamic online, offline, what's happening online meets or matches what's happening offline. From this point of view, internet is not sufficient. We see that mainly with the existence of concrete networks, material recruitment networks, which is most of the recruitments, explaining that in fact, most of the jihadis are linked or connected one to the other. A consumption of propaganda in group, giving more strength to the propaganda. You can have propaganda and beside a network. In my opinion, together with propaganda, the importance of internet is to contact, to link or putting together people who may commit a terrorist attack. You cannot become really a jihadist. We have proofs of young would-be jihadists who could not make it to Syria because they had no concrete contacts. So radicalization online played a role, but on a short period of time, between 2014 and 2016, on very young profiles, less constructed from an intellectual point of view. Let's not neglect the ground, because it's on the ground that things happened after 2012, less after 2014. I invite, like it was said previously, to step back, like Hugo said. So not to focus on one event, on one aspect of things. Now, if you look at what's happening on the social networks from the jihadism and terrorist attacks, let's step back and not focus on the jihadosphere, if you can call it that way. As Laurence said, propaganda is more and more difficult to access. You have to look for it to access it. So you have to be really committed to jihadism already. Think of looking what's upstream, go to other ideological content and religious content, Salafi contents that are in a kind of radicality without being extremist. And that could lead to violence. Let's quote the example of Jamal G, the terrorist who killed a police officer in Rambouillet last April. His profile on Facebook showed over the past years someone who was not committed religiously to someone who was committed religiously, fed by an array of publications linked to identity points about posts about Islamophobia and hatred content. Non-violent, not appearing as violent on Facebook, but leading him into identity perspective, getting him to be locked in a bubble. Oh, this kind of bubbles do not become violent, but there is a risk of closing in that is present and can lead some individuals that are engaged in this ideological environment, concrete, because they live in neighborhoods where the involvement is very important, can lead some people to become violent. Keep it there for the time being. Thank you, first round table. I'll leave the floor to Ezra Sa'ar. So what's the Israeli method of Israeli intelligence? Well, Ezra, Elecha. שומעים אותך.
Yes. Can you hear me? Excuse me?
שומעים אותך, לך.
Israeli experience, as one remark, I was for 35 years part of the Israeli intelligence community, heading one of the counterterrorism units in the West Bank and Jerusalem for a few years. And then afterwards, I was heading the international cooperation unit, which led to many operations with some other intelligence agencies around the world, particularly, of course, in Europe, trying to thwart this danger, not only from jihadi or Hamas movement, but from other aspects. So I'm talking on the base of my experience and what I saw in the West Bank, and especially in Jerusalem and in Israel during the years of 2012, 2015, and I would try to focus on 2015. So the reality in Jerusalem in 2015 was that there was kind of a wave of terror or terrorism of ISIS in the world, of course, extremism, and kind of some terror attacks on Temple Mount, the Israeli Islamic movement, which is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood around the world, is taking over of what's going on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And there is a reality of terrorism coming from some organizations in the West Bank, leading by Hamas, but also by Islamic Jihad and PFLP, especially after the operation of Protective Edge in Gaza in 2014. So what we found in Jerusalem when I was heading this unit was there was a massive terror attack, a kind of a lone wolf attacks between the months, between October and December. It was inspired especially by what was happening in Syria and in Europe during that time. Of course, some of the attacks were in France and some other places over the globe. It was inspired by these operations, by that particular wave. And we had some particular religious in these terror attacks, but not always, as I can mention or elaborate in a minute or two. So the aspects of the perpetrators were they didn't have any certain organizational characteristics. It means that they came from various and different organizations, as we call them, lone wolves. It was most of the attacks were self-made attacks with no other aid from any other group. Of course, they didn't have any particular Islamic extremism background. It was kind of a various ideological terror groups or terrorists. Many women, as was mentioned here before, were participating in these attacks, and also kids. And it was kind of a process that after we investigate and interrogate these people, we saw that it was not an impulsive attack. It was after a kind of a process that they had between themselves, and that's why it was very difficult to identify or to allocate the process itself, or to see exactly when they are moving from thoughts to deeds. So part of the characteristics of these terrorists were that their ages were between 20 and 30. Most of them were singles. Most of them, but not all of them, were singles. They didn't have any particular religious background behind them. They had some kind of psychological problems and many personal problems, some tensions within the families, between a husband and a wife, or father and son, etc., etc. They came from a very low socio-economical level, or some other economical problems. In the year before they made this attack, they had kind of a problematic relationship with the neighborhood or with the environment, and they were exposed to incitements. Just to put you on the figures, on the numbers, to make sure, of course, the reality in Israel, I'm sure that you are all aware to the reality in Israel here, but during the year of 2015, we had about 30 or 28 fatalities only in 1 year, but 25 out of them, 25 out of 28 were between the months of October and December during that wave, which marks a really big problem that we had. As we saw it, it was kind of a wave that we weren't really ready for that. So the main threat in our eyes during that time was, especially when I was heading the operations room, was the imminent decision or the imminent deed itself, or the operation itself, once he decided or she decided to make this attack. The second thing, or the second threat, was the availability of the weapons. They used anything they could. It was knives, axes, rundowns, that mean cars. They used anything that they could in order to attack Israeli innocent citizens, not only in Jerusalem, but also in some other cities in Israel. They didn't have any security background or any criminal background. Most of them with no background or files in our systems. We saw involvement, as I mentioned before, of women and teenagers in these attacks. It was a huge threat because at that time we were not targeting these kinds of population because we were targeting some other groups that were known to us. We are not collecting as intelligence organization. We do not collect on any kind of group in the society, of course. There was kind of a global incitement mood against the West, and there was kind of an encouragement, as was mentioned before in the previous speakers that talked about the web, especially, of course, it wasn't yet TikTok, but through Facebook and some other social medias. They just saw what is happening in Europe and in Syria, and they got were just imitating these attacks. Our main challenge, of course, as we saw it, as we mentioned it at that time, was that we're transferring from massive terror attacks into terror in mass production. That means that we had to move very fast or to make a kind of a transformation or organizational transformation in the Shin Bet, trying to take care or in these terrorists, because back then, or until back then, we were dealing with, as I said or mentioned before, with organizations and not with the lone wolves. So the classical thwarting answer was less adjustable to these situations. It was a bit difficult to us to identify the threat or the process that the terrorist is going through. And but most of all, I think the main challenge was to identify and to, of course, to arrest the terrorist while he is in bed, before he is going out. And we had to have a very fast law and law enforcement organizations just to arrest and to bring them into court, and to have a very encourage law kind of a law, I don't know how to say it in English exactly, but to be very, let's say the courts had to be very dominant in trying to put them in jail as far as they can. So the solution that we found, and we had to find it very fast, because the public opinion was really, you know, everything in the media was very in a panic. The streets were in a panic, the population was in a panic. So we had to try to monitor these network fingerprints. So we developed some intelligence tools based upon pop-ups of words, text, pictures, or some other elements that can lead us into intentions of these particular people. We had to, of course, to catch the mouse as it was on the computer and bring it into court to try to put people in jail according to things that were on the web. Wasn't so easy back then. Today it is much more easier for us, because we really developed this system with the court and with the police. And we had to try to bring together also our human sources and assets in try to identify some leads over these terrorists or extremist public declarations that they made in order to identify these terrorists. The other thing that we developed is a very sophisticated data mining systems that allowed us to put all the information and the intelligence that we had from the network on the table, together with some other tools that we had, such as human sources or SIGINT sources, and try to put them all together and to make sure that we are arresting the right people before they are making these attacks. The next phase, as was said before, was trying to block these networks or these profile networks, trying to have some help from social networks. Back then it was Facebook. It wasn't so easy, because they were very, they had their own business to run, and it was very hard to try to convince them to come or to work together with us. And of course, after arresting these elements or these terrorists, was to put them to trial, to court, and to publish, of course, all the judge or the judicial court process into the internet, so everything will be as open as it can be to the public. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Ezra. Justement,
Thank you, Ezra. I will get back to that for the next roundtable. What you said, it was very interesting, very precise about what has been done in Israel, recurring to strong methods and stopping terrorists before they perpetrate their action. I'll ask Laurence. You're saying that we were in a cyber jihadism that is less strong as rather a routine jihadism. In fact, would it be important to implement such tools that were implemented in Israel? Is it still useful today, knowing that we are in a decline, or would it be an error not to look at it? Thank you, Etienne, for your question. Yes, there are several things about I wish to answer to what the various speakers said. We can start with that. Indeed, the issue of the algorithm of intelligence and the black boxes put forward currently. Indeed, we can raise this issue. I think that we have no choice in terms of volume. We're still on huge volumes in terms of official content, unofficial content, and what we can call the degraded, or not degraded, but depleted level. We are on high volumes, and acted in France were unknown to the intelligence services. And for that, those are the two good reasons that make it that the government should sustain those algorithms of intelligence, because it will enable to combine, as Ezra Sa explained, weak signals of digital behavior that can flag a possible move to action. Or we have seen it recently with a terrorist of the Louvre in Paris, who was recently on trial. He had not an unusual behavior on the internet, but on the eve of his attack, he published a quotation of Al-Nani, of a former spokesperson of ISIS. So this kind of behavior is unusual, and an algorithm can identify it, a combination of soft signals or weak signals that can really flag or warn or raise an alarm. We have to be cautious about an algorithm for several reasons. It cannot be the beginning and the end of the answer, because the algorithm will not be able to go everywhere. We have all the encrypted systems compelling us to have a certain amount of agreement with the private companies. It's not going to be done overnight. It will not be done without the monitoring of a certain amount of organizations. So what do we do when we have identified the weak signals? It's an important question. If you have an unusual behavior, does it mean that this individual will act really? And what do you do then? Are we going to go to administrative intelligence? Let's not fall into what we could call a minority report syndrome. Know before the other their intentions. And it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy somewhere. So it's a thin line, and we will not be able to do without tools like that. I'd like to get back quickly on other points. This panel is very well made. The media jihad is a non-symmetrical war of the weak against the strong. Harassment, taqiyya, dissimulation, short, and there cannot be a winner. You need a systemic answer of some of the actors. We progressed since 2015 with players, private actors, like Satman said, institutional actors, like Samouris said, and the answer can come from three steps: punitive, coercive, suppression of links. An answer that could be linked to intelligence regarding the digital behavior of those people, and as in true life, a preventive step, the counter narration, the alternative speech, and this kind of elements. One last point, and I'll stop there. Benjamin Hodaye said about the various doors of entrance. We are currently facing a double phenomenon, a phenomenon of, say, widened sphere of violent threats and a more common violence. Let me explain. We have a propaganda linked to the news out of the jihadi circles. During the republishing of the caricatures, there were a lot of jihadi propaganda, but the anti-French propaganda, sometimes very violent, calling for murder, went out from those circles. Political, sports people, and so on and so forth. And this raised the issue of what content should be suppressed and what can be defined as a non-legal content, illegal content. My second point is that we are also in line with a depleted hatred. For quite a long time, a content of ISIS that was calling for murder was shocking for us. And when from the ISIS disclosed or published more violence, it depleted our sensitivity to violence regarding contents that were extremely shocking previously. We are in the step of greater acceptance of a kind of online violence, harassment, insults. Again, the cursor to regulate the internet has moved. It's complex to implement because all those parameters are in play. Thank you, Laurence. Question from Die Welt, Ibrahim Nader, asking, what do we know about how do jihadists communicate online? Anthony Maurice, you're supervising this activity of the jihadists on the European level. So how do they communicate currently? Anthony Maurice, you have the floor.
Yes, I think it's mentioned already that today the online landscape, the jihadist landscape, is fragmented. So and it's dynamic, and it's 2012, 2013 when the jihadist organizations moved to social media. One thing is sure, as I said in my intervention, jihadist organizations and networks invest in their online communications for various reasons. Of course, it is known that there have been cases in the past in which terrorists organized or communicated about the planning or the organization of attacks through digital means. Or of course with propaganda, it's clear that they try to reach out to audiences and mobilize supporters to their cause. So it is clear that digital communications play an important role in the way the jihadist networks organize their work. And I would agree with Laurence that if one wants to tackle this, we should look at that at different aspects. So one is of course investigations, is the use of technology, the new tools to investigate online communications. The other is prevention. So how you prevent people from getting hooked up in these online communications. But what we need to keep in mind is also that this is only the means of communication. This is the internet or digital media is just an enabler. It's not the root cause of terrorism. So we have to do also groundwork, like in our societies, in our communities, and offline, not only online, in order like to have this holistic approach. The only thing I can say is that I expect, of course, the digital landscape like to play a role also in the coming years. This is clear. As I said, like it is a very fast evolving environment, and we all try like to catch up with the technology and how this is used or abused by terrorists. But we have also like to recognize that there has been some progress. So the situation is not the same as like in 2000, as I said, 12 or 13 or 15. In terms, especially in terms of the dissemination of content, there are steps that have been taken. So it is clearly more difficult now to stumble upon terrorist content as you go by your daily browsing of the internet. This was very critical back in 2015 when average users could come across terrorist content just following popular accounts. And we have like to praise the work that tech companies have done in this respect to secure their communities from access to, or from the random access to this content. Of course, terrorist content will always be there. We cannot pretend that we will be in a position to eliminate terrorist content from the internet, but this fragmented environment gives also a lot of opportunities for investigators, for communities, like to identify these networks that really are influential and try to work against them.
Merci Antonis. Alors, je suis vraiment désolé, on est pris par le temps.
Thank you very much, Antonis. We're running out of time. I apologize. Let's wrap up this conversation with hands-on suggestions, because at the end of the day, that's what we care about. How can we concretely fight terror? Go ahead. I'll be quick and hands-on, I promise. Now, talking about online regulation, there's a lot of talk of repression or punishments. Measures have been taken at the French and the European level. And number one, the goal is to stop the dissemination of terrorist content, and secondly, track those people who consult that content. And maybe we're lagging behind in terms of our understanding, the same way in terms of how we're addressing jihadism in general. Because it was an emergency, we punished. But it took us a while before we engaged in prevention efforts of a more thorough nature and before we escalated the problems. Now, Mr. Hucheron said that earlier. Now, here's an idea, here's a proposal. Let's look at the algorithms in a different way. And for example, let's look at the latest terror attacks. We had individuals who trapped themselves into an ideological bubble comprised of propaganda. The propaganda wasn't always there, but also a wider variety of much less radical content, as Laurence said earlier. So the idea would be to fight this type of monopoly, because there are specific types of ideological or identity-based or religious content that hold a monopoly on social media. For example, if you look up something specific about religion on Google, there are Salafi, Saudi, and Qatari sites that may not have connections with the public authorities of these countries that come up first in the list of hits. And so people get trapped in a material they find is that kind of stuff. So in recent years, we have been talking about reducing the visibility of this type of content and also trying to promote other more moderate alternative content on the side. And I think we need a two-pronged approach. Thank you, Benjamin. Ms. Saltman, any proposals, concrete proposals for fighting cyber jihadism, maybe convincing those platforms that are protecting users in an opaque way, maybe?
Yeah, I think that we need, as each sector, to do what each sector does best together. And I say that because oftentimes one sector tries to be another, maybe government tries to make the tech, or tech tries to do what civil society should do. And actually, in a multi-stakeholder fashion, if government does what government does best, and tech what tech does best, and civil society what civil society does best, we get a lot further. And what that looks like is that it is up to technology companies to further tooling, to further different approaches in the process of more proactively surfacing, reviewing, and where applicable, removing validating entities and content. And those are three different things. The ability to surface, the ability to review, and the ability to remove are often very different pipelines, and all of those take different types of tooling. And then where applicable, share that tooling. And this gets very difficult. Some stuff is open source. We can find open source for photo and video matching technology, for example. We can find open source with some linguistic detection, but a lot of the open source material needs to be better in quality. And a lot of the bigger tech companies, just like in GiveCT, need to actually carry some of the smaller companies that might have millions of global users, but are oftentimes microsites and are not well monetized. So there's also a very big difference between big company in terms of user base versus big company in terms of who has finance and structure to help others and get the internet as a whole to a better place. I think for civil society will always be the credible voice. A couple of speakers have talked about root causes of radicalization. It starts locally, it starts socially. Radicalization is a social phenomena, whether or not it's online or offline. It is social by nature. And so when we talk about counter speech or contre-discours, we see that the voice has to come from society, from peer-to-peer networks, from interfaith leaders, from different credible voices. But it's the jobs of tech companies to strategically upscale and optimize those voices online. And it's the job of government to provide funding and infrastructure to support those social movements and endeavors. And we see some of that in France and elsewhere. There are some examples, but they aren't very sustainable as they stand, and they need more infrastructure. And then really government is there to help designate and put these violent extremist terrorist groups on lists. It's easy enough to point to Daesh and Al-Qaeda. There are a huge variety of violent extremist terrorist trends that are often never put on government lists. And tech companies look to those lists to help them decide what should be removed. I know that the European Commission is going through a process right now to see what violent white supremacist terrorism looks like and how to get different types of groups on those lists right now. Governments also really, there are spaces for smart regulation to help guide tech companies, especially in some of these spaces of knowing what can be proactively disclosed to law enforcement without violating privacy, what is the right line in the sand for how to use metadata, even in an end-to-end encrypted network, using metadata to help guide and see sources to get to the actual terrorists or violent extremists. And so I think that there's this role for each of our sectors to do what we do best, but do it together.
Merci beaucoup, Erin. Un mot rapide de conclusion, Ezra. Vous nous en avez déjà dit beaucoup.
A quick word of conclusion, Ezra. You already said so much regarding the measures being taken in Israel. Can more be done? Should more be done? And if that is the case, how?
Yes, just a few remarks. First of all, I think that the answer doesn't lie in trying to regulate some social medias or social networks. I think that there are 3 points that I would like to emphasize. First of all is the cooperation between the law enforcement organizations within the countries. That means the police, the courts, the intelligence, they all have to sit around a round table as we do right now. Each side will bring its own perspective and try to see the imminent threat in the country. In the countries that we cooperated with and elaborated a bit more about these issues, we saw that they had some very good outcome of these meetings. The second thing is trying to monitor the network as much or develop the tools within the intelligence or police or some other law enforcement organizations within the countries to try to monitor the networks. And the third thing is try to develop some data mining tools within the police in order to dig out these people. I think that the way of trying to, let's say, to educate or to regulate the social network, it is a very long way. It will be very hard and with a very, let's say, not such a very good public opinion about that, especially I think in Western Europe. So I'm focusing on the thwarting, of course. That's why my proposal came from this perspective. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Ezra. C'est vrai que ça va être très
Thank you very
difficile.
much, Ezra. You're absolutely right. It must be very difficult to fight cyber jihadism when you realize there are 361 different platforms. It sounds like mission impossible, but that is indeed an avenue that can be explored, cooperation, collaboration. I wish we had more time to talk, but maybe next time we can have a counter summit so we can explore other opportunities and answers. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you. Thank you so much for this remarkable work. Ladies and gentlemen, you have moderated such an important and educational timetable. We've heard amazing speakers. We have learned so much. We've been talking for 3 hours now, and we're only 10 minutes late. Only 10 minutes. It really could be much worse. So as far as organizing a counter summit is concerned, I agree. Let's organize it together. Because it's so frustrating not being able to dig deeper, and unfortunately the clock is always ticking and we will wish we had more time to explore the topic further. So yeah, let's get together again. I have good news, however. There's going to be a 4th edition of our European Summit on Islamist Radicalization and Terrorist Threats. There's going to be a 4th edition, and if all goes well, it'll be held in October, in person, people. In person, but we'll have further opportunities to invite and re-invite you all, dear speakers, to attend this meeting in person, along with the organizations that have supported this program. So I'm not going to add more comments to this wrap-up, but I would like to hand over to Camille Godot, representing the Montaigne Institute, one of the 2 foundations that have acted as our partners for the 3rd edition of the European Summit. So Camille Godot will wrap up today's summit. And I wish you all an excellent evening, an excellent week, an excellent summer. Be healthy, stay safe, and let's make sure we avoid a 3rd lockdown in the fall. There's already talk of a 3rd lockdown, so let's make sure we avoid it. Camille, take it away. Thank you very much. We at the Montaigne Institute have been very happy to be involved today, together with ELNET and the Seidel Foundation, in organizing the 3rd edition of this European Summit on Islamist Radicalization and Terrorist Threats. I think that I'll be quick. I think the key word here, the operative word, is European cooperation. And this is something that cropped up quite a bit in the course of today's session. And I think it's an opportunity to evaluate European public policy in terms of disengagement, to understand the counter discourse and the importance of religious content, and also identify ways and means for fighting cyber jihadism. We are working on Islamist radicalization and the rise in political and radical Islam in France for several years now. In 2018, under the aegis of Hakim El-Karoui, at the Montaigne Institute, we have published a study on how Islamism is manufactured, the Islamist factory. In 2021, with the Fayard Publishing House, we published a book on jihadi militants, Portrait of a Generation. And we contributed over 1,400 jihadi profiles. We reviewed 1,400 jihadi profiles, and we based ourselves on both qualitative and quantitative investigations in the course of our research. So it is important to continue to feed this channel hole, this public discussion, and basically feed into the vision and the strategy of public authorities in terms of the fight against radical Islamism. It is key in terms of national security, and more generally, it is key to the future of the EU. So I'm totally in favor of organizing yet another session with you all. And thank you so much for today's fruitful discussions. And of course, many thanks to ELNET and the Hans Seidel Foundation. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Godspeed.